and beyond. For me, it is the last beautiful flower in the perfect bouquet, because the 20 years that I had as a professional athlete playing for those 4 wonderful teams, and that 20-year period in California would ever end up in Cooperstown, New York. You say, how in the world can it happen? And it can happen very easily when you have the kinds of friends, the kinds of people, the kinds of support, the kinds of education, and most importantly, the kinds of family that I've had.
I mean, it's a continual learning process, and part of that learning process is teaching yourself that you do belong. And each step, it's like in any profession, each step gives you a bit more confidence, etc. And finally, you get to the point where you say, and it really, I think, the solidification of that for me was the All-Star game in '67.
The truth revealed is this: the story of Tom Seaver did not end with a trophy or a standing ovation or a plaque in Cooperstown. It ended quietly in a house in California with a man who could no longer remember the games that defined a generation. This is what really happened to Tom Terrific, and the full picture is more painful than most fans were ever told. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icons. He was the greatest pitcher the New York Mets ever produced. He turned a joke of a franchise into world champions. He won 3 Cy Young Awards, reached 311 career victories, and walked into the Hall of Fame with the highest vote percentage in history at that time. The man was a legend in every sense of the word. But 2 separate forces worked against him across the decades, one built by the decisions of powerful men who should have known better and chose not to, and one built by biology itself, slow and invisible, completely indifferent to reputation. By the time the world learned what was truly happening to him, the window to change anything had already closed. For years, the public version of Tom Seaver's story was clean and heroic: the Miracle Mets, 3 Cy Young Awards, the Hall of Fame, a vineyard in California where he lived a quiet and dignified life after baseball. That was the story most people carried with them. The real story is something different. It is the story of a franchise that exiled the most important player it ever had because of arrogance and a personal attack in a newspaper column. It is the story of a disease contracted while gardening in Connecticut that went unrecognized long enough to do permanent and irreversible damage, one of the sharpest minds the game of baseball ever produced. And it is the story of a group of old teammates who flew across the country to say goodbye to a man who could no longer hold a conversation for more than a few minutes without losing the thread completely. If this story hits you the way it should, tap the hype feature on this video and give it some hype so more fans can hear the real truth about Tom Seaver. In March of 2019, the National Baseball Hall of Fame released a quiet statement on behalf of the Seaver family. Tom had been diagnosed with dementia. He was retiring completely from public life. He would not be making appearances. He would not be giving interviews. He would not even be able to attend the 50th anniversary reunion of the 1969 Miracle Mets, the team he had carried to one of the most improbable championships in the history of professional sport. The man at the center of it all, the player who had made that season possible and that franchise meaningful, would not be in the room when his teammates gathered to mark what they had built together. That announcement hit the baseball world hard. But what most people did not know, and what the family had kept private for years by that point, was how long the decline had actually been happening. The 2019 diagnosis was not the beginning of the story. It was close to the end of it. Tom Seaver died on August 31, 2020. He was 75 years old. He passed away peacefully in his sleep at his home in Calistoga, California, from complications of Lewy body dementia and a COVID-19 infection he had contracted during the early months of the global pandemic. He was survived by his wife Nancy and their 2 daughters, Sarah and Anne. The grief was immediate and enormous. Keith Hernandez, his former teammate, released a statement that captured the feeling of an entire sport. He wrote that he was deeply saddened by the passing of Tom Seaver, that he had had the honor of unsuccessfully hitting against him and having him as a teammate, and that Seaver was the greatest Met of all time, and that no one who ever wore the orange and blue would surpass him. He ended his statement with a single word: tears. Gary Cohen, who had worked alongside Seaver as a broadcaster for years, offered something a little different. He said that while the news brought deep sadness, there was also a kind of light in it because the suffering had been prolonged and the decline had been agonizing to watch from a distance. He said Tom had represented their childhood, had been a light that everyone could look to. Even in the moment of loss, Cohen was reaching for the warmth that Seaver had always represented to the people who had watched him pitch and work and live. Lewy body dementia is a progressive disorder. It is the second most common form of progressive dementia after Alzheimer's disease, yet it remains widely misunderstood and frequently misdiagnosed. What happens inside the brain is this: abnormal deposits of a protein called alpha-synuclein build up within neurons. These deposits are known as Lewy bodies, and as they accumulate, They begin to disrupt the chemical messengers the brain depends on to function. The damage spreads across multiple systems simultaneously. Cognition and memory begin to fracture, with severe fluctuations in alertness and the gradual loss of short-term retention. Motor control breaks down, producing symptoms that resemble Parkinson's disease, including rigid muscles, slow-moving tremors. Behavior and sleep are also targeted, with vivid hallucinations, paranoia, and rapid cognitive fatigue becoming part of daily existence. For Tom Seaver, a man who had built his entire identity around absolute bodily control and a razor-sharp analytical mind, progression of Lewy body dementia form of deterioration. The disease targeted precisely the qualities that had made him exceptional. But to understand how he arrived at that ending, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to full scale of what was built before it was slowly and systematically taken apart. The New York Mets secured Tom Seaver's signing rights through a special draft lottery in 1966. The team had finished in last place nearly every season since its founding in 1962. They were a punchline in professional baseball, beloved by their fans for a particular kind of chaotic, losing charm, but not taken seriously by anyone who followed the sport with a competitive eye. Seaver changed that almost immediately upon arrival. He came with a discipline forged during his service in the United States Marine Corps, clinical and analytical approach to preparation that treated pitching as a technical problem to be solved rather than an athletic feat to be admired from the outside. His delivery was built around his legs and his core, a drop-and-drive style that generated power from the ground up and made him devastatingly hard to square up at the plate. In 1967, he won the National League Rookie of the Year award. He was not yet 23 years old and already the most serious person in the organization. He studied hitters the way engineers study load-bearing structure. He tracked his own mechanics with an obsession that went far beyond ordinary preparation. He believed in hard work and repeatable process and disciplined study in a way that made him unusual even among athletes at the highest level. He did not rely on feel or instinct the way many pitchers do. He relied on preparation so thorough that feel was no longer the main variable. By 1969, he had transformed the Mets into something nobody in baseball could have predicted or scripted in advance. Under manager Gil Hodges, a man who demanded accountability and brought a structure to the clubhouse that matched Seaver's own disposition, that team caught fire in the second half of the season and simply did not stop until they were the best team in the world. Seaver finished with a record of 25-7 and an ERA of 2.21. He won his first Cy Young Award. He was 24 years old and already the face of the franchise, already the axis around which everything else on the team turned and organized itself. The pitching depth behind him, the moments of clutch offense, the improbable defensive plays, all of it was made possible, the standard he set at the top of the rotation every fifth day. The Miracle Mets were built on belief and pitching depth and a few moments of genuine magic, but the foundation under all of it was Tom Seaver. Remove him from that equation, and the whole story of 1969 becomes something entirely different. His dominance continued into the following decade without interruption or meaningful decline. On April 22, 1970, he took the mound against the San Diego Padres and struck out 19 batters, tying a major league record that had stood for decades. He did not give up a hit until the fifth inning. The last 10 hitters of the game went down consecutively on strikes, each one dismissed in sequence with the methodical control of a man who was simply executing a plan. The stadium was on its feet for every pitch of that final stretch, and the roar when the last out was recorded was the sound of an entire building, understanding that it had witnessed something irrepeatable. 10 strikeouts in a row to end the game. The record still stands in his name. He won his second Cy Young Award in 1973, going 21-12 with a 2.08 ERA and leading the Mets back to the World Series. He won his third in 1975 after recovering from a year hampered by sciatica, posting 22 wins with 2.38 ERA, 3 Cy Young Awards, 311 career wins, a Hall of Fame vote share of 98.8%, the highest percentage achieved by any player up to that point in the history of the ballot. These were not statistics accumulated by a player who had survived long enough to build a resume through longevity. They were the output of a pitcher who had been, for a sustained and consistent stretch of time, the best in the world at what he did. And that stature, that deep and earned understanding of his own values is exactly what put him on a collision course with the men running the New York Mets organization. The collision did not happen in a single dramatic confrontation. It was built slowly through years of contract negotiations that revealed in precise and uncomfortable detail what the front office truly thought about the players who made their franchise worth anything at all. The man at the center of that power structure was M. Donald Grant, the board chairman. Grant was old school baseball management in its most uncompromising and flattering form. He operated under the conviction that athletes should remain subservient to the organization, that the club's interests outweighed any individual claim to fair compensation, and that a player who argued for his own value was not making a reasonable business case, but displaying a character defect that needed to be checked. Seaver would later describe Grant's approach toward his players as a plantation mentality. That is a blunt and pointed phrase. Based on the documented record of their years together, it is an accurate one. The pattern runs back to 1972. After winning 18 games the previous season, Seaver requested a salary of $125,000. The negotiations were miserable enough that Seaver publicly described them as the most depressing experience of his career. He settled for $120,000. The following year, after 21-12, he asked for a $30,000 raise. The Mets offered $10,000. They settled eventually on $140,000. In 1974, after another Cy Young Award season and a trip to the World Series, the general manager stated on the record that a line had to be drawn somewhere on what a pitcher was worth. They settled on $170,000. Then came 1975, and the decision that probably completed the poisoning of any goodwill that had survived the years of difficult bargaining. Seaver had struggled the prior year with sciatica, winning only 11 games. Grant invoked the maximum allowable 20% pay cut, dropping Seaver's salary to $136,000 for the 1975 season. He had the contractual right to do it. He chose to exercise that right against a man who delivered 3 Cy Young Awards and a World Series championship for the organization without hesitation or sentiment. Seaver came back the following year and won 22 games and his 3rd Cy Young Award. Grant reinstated the salary. But the damage to the relationship was permanent. Grant had shown exactly what the organization's regard for Tom Seaver was worth the moment that permitted him to show it. By 1976, free agency had arrived and the entire economic structure of professional baseball was being rebuilt. Catfish Hunter had signed a $3.75 million contract with the Yankees. The reserve clause that had bound players to their team indefinitely had been legally overturned. For the first time in the sport's history, players were allowed to understand their actual market value. Seaver, an articulate leader and an active representative for the Major League Baseball Players Association, understood exactly what the market was now saying about a pitcher of his caliber. He demanded a 3-year extension worth $800,000 total. For a 3-time Cy Young winner still performing at an elite level, this was not an excessive ask in the new landscape. Grant refused anyway and dug in with the conviction of a man defending a principle he had held his entire career rather than adapting to a reality that had changed around him. He viewed the demand not as a reasonable contract negotiation, but as an affront to organizational authority. The tension stretched through the winter and into the spring of 1977, with trade rumors circulating openly around Seaver's name. He made clear he would only accept a trade to 4 specific: the Dodgers, the Reds, the Phillies, or the Pirates. He wanted to stay in New York. The list was his protection if the organization left him no choice. In a final genuine attempt to make things work, Seaver bypassed Grant entirely and went directly to the team's owner, Lorinda DeRoulet. She was sympathetic to the man who had made her franchise worth owning. She agreed to a 3-year extension worth $1.1 million total, paying $300,000 in the first year and $400,000 in each of the following 2 years. Trade discussions were stopped. The deal was made. Seaver was going to stay. Then the morning of June 15, 1977 arrived, and with it a column in the New York Daily News written by Dick Young. Young had long operated as a voice that closely reflected front office perspectives, and his column that morning did not engage with the contract or the logic of the market. He did not argue about whether $800,000 over 3 years was for a 3-time Cy Young winner. He did not address whether the agreement DeRoulet had made was fair or unfair to the organization. Instead, it's asserted that Seaver's demands were driven by jealousy of Nolan Ryan, who had signed with the California Angels and was now earning more. Young suggested that the real issue was not market value or labor rights or years of difficult negotiations with a front office that had resented Seaver's self-awareness from the beginning. He claimed it was petty professional envy of a former teammate, and then Young wrote the specific line that shattered the agreement: that Ryan was getting more than Seaver. This galled Tom because Nancy Seaver and Ruth Ryan were very friendly, and that Seaver had long treated Ryan like a brother. He put Nancy Seaver's name in a newspaper column about a labor dispute. He used her personal friendship with another player's wife as a weapon against her husband, turning a professional contract negotiation into something intimate and ugly and impossible to move past. This was not an accident or a careless mention. It was a deliberate choice to use the most personal element available: the relationship between 2 women who had been close friends during their husbands' shared years on the Mets roster as the instrument of maximum damage. Whatever purpose it was meant to serve, the effect was immediate and irreversible. Seaver read the column that morning and called the Mets front office. Whatever patience he had extended across years of pay cuts and demeaning negotiations and a management culture that had never once treated him as a partner rather than a commodity, it was finished. He said clearly and without room for interpretation, "That is it. It is all over. Make the deal." On the night of June 15, 1977, The Mets finalized the trade that sent Tom Seaver to the Cincinnati Reds. On the exact same night, they also traded Dave Kingman, a legitimate power hitter who had clubbed 37 home runs the previous season, to the San Diego Padres, and Mike Phillips to the St. Louis Cardinals. 3 significant pieces gone in a single evening in a set of transactions that Mets fans have called the Midnight Massacre ever since. The name is right in every sense of the word. It happened at night. It felt like an assassination. The franchise that had been built into something real over the prior decade had been gutted in the time it takes a city to go to sleep. It felt less like a series of calculated business decisions and more like an organization dismantling its own foundation in a single act of management failure and institutional dysfunction. For Seaver, the Mets received Pat Zachary, a starting pitcher at 3-7 with a 5.04 ERA at the time of the trade. Doug Flynn, utility infielder who won 91 in New York. Steve Henderson, a promising minor league outfielder, finished second in NL Rookie of the Year voting and showed genuine talent. And Dan Norman, a minor league outfielder who spent most of his Mets tenure underperforming or in the minors and never became a meaningful contributor at the major league level. That was the exchange. The full accounting for the greatest player in franchise history. Seaver pitched his Reds debut 3 days later and threw a 3-hit shutout. He did not need a grace period. He did not carry the emotional weight of the circumstances onto the mound in any visible way. He went out and did what he had always done because the only thing he knew how to do with difficult work. He finished the remainder of that 1977 season at 14-3 with a 2.34 ERA. He had been traded midseason, relocated to a new city, separated from the organization that had been his professional home for more than a decade, and he immediately became one of the best pitchers in the National League. Baseball writers compared the transaction to the hypothetical of the New York Yankees trading Mickey Mantle to the Boston Red Sox in his prime. That comparison was not hyperbole. It was a genuine attempt to find the closest equivalent in the sport's history because nothing else quite captured the scale of what the Mets had done to themselves. M. Donald Grant, defending himself to the media in the weeks that followed, declared with full confidence that 20 years from now people would remember it as the Dan Norman trade. Dan Norman never established himself as a meaningful major league player. The Mets lost tens of thousands of fans over the following seasons. Their attendance collapsed and did not recover for years. Their competitive standing fell apart entirely. Grant resigned in 1978, pushed out by the accumulated pressure of what his management era had produced. The franchise spent the better part of a decade in the wilderness he had helped create. Seaver kept pitching. He went on to win his 300th game, finished with 311 victories, elected to the Hall of Fame with a vote share that no player in the history of the ballot had ever achieved before him. Returned briefly to New York in 1983 when the Mets reacquired him, giving the fans who had been waiting 6 years a chance to see him in their colors again. He survived the exile. He proved on the field every single year exactly what the Mets had given away. But the next enemy was already present inside him, building quietly in the years after 1991, and it had nothing to do with management or newspaper columns or any decision any human being had made. After baseball, Seaver worked as a broadcaster and a scout. Like many elite competitors after their career's end, he searched for something that could give his days the same focus and purpose and physical demand that pitching had always required. In 1997, he and Nancy purchased 116 acres on Diamond Mountain in Calistoga, California, in the northern end of Napa Valley. The land was undeveloped and forested and needed to be shaped into something. That was exactly the kind of project he was looking for. Around 2000, they planted approximately 3.5 acres of vineyard dedicated almost entirely to Cabernet Sauvignon. Vineyard manager Jim Barbour and winemaker Thomas Rivers Brown joined the operation. Production was kept deliberately small, between 400 and 600 cases per year, built around a single premium bottling called the GTS Cabernet Sauvignon. He worked the rows himself every day, clippers in his pocket, his Labrador retrievers moving through the vines alongside him. He pruned and cleared brush and sorted fruit beside his team. He had grown up in Fresno, California, where his father had worked in the raisin industry. Agriculture was not new to him. The connection to the land was personal and genuine, not the casual hobby of a famous person for a story to tell. The vineyard was a sanctuary. It was a place where he could channel the same obsessive focus that had once gone into studying hitters and perfecting mechanics into something physical and slow and deeply grounding. The work of a vineyard does not accommodate shortcuts or approximations. The vines have to be pruned at the right time, in the right way, for reasons that accumulate over seasons and years. The soil has to be understood. The weather has to be read. It demands the kind of sustained, systematic attention that had always been Seaver's natural mode. He was not a man who could sit still and feel you. The vineyard did not ask him to sit still. For those who knew what was happening inside his body, it also served as something else. A daily act of staying present, staying physical, staying connected to the world, the concrete work of his hands. Because the neurological deterioration that would eventually take his life had already begun its slow and its silent approach. The health story begins in 1991. While working in his garden in Greenwich, Connecticut, Seaver was bitten by a tick carrying the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. He contracted the infection. He was treated with standard antibiotics and appeared to recover. For most people, early and effective treatment resolves Lyme disease without long-term consequences. But the bacteria responsible, Borrelia burgdorferi, has the capacity to persist in the body and remain dormant for extended periods, particularly in the central nervous system, when initial treatment does not fully eliminate it. It can wait. For years, it can simply wait. For Seaver, the reactivation came in 2012, more than 2 decades after the original infection had seemingly been resolved. The relapse was severe and deeply disorienting. He described the experience as a perpetual case of the flu, a relentless, grinding physical misery that would not lift. He suffered profound fatigue, sleep disturbances, severe nausea, and Bell's palsy, which is a condition where one side of the face becomes temporarily weak or partially paralyzed due to inflammation of the facial nerve. But the symptom that alarmed him most was cognitive. He began experiencing significant short-term memory lapses and fusion that were frightening enough to make him fear at various points that he had suffered a stroke. For a man whose identity had been built on precision and mental acuity, these episodes were a bit of horror. Early in 2013, the diagnosis arrived: stage 3 neurological Lyme disease. The infection had crossed into his central nervous system and had been advancing inside his brain for months before it was properly identified. The delay was not a small thing. Doctors told Seaver directly that the neurological damage was irreversible. His memory loss would gradually worsen over time. There was no treatment that could undo what the unrecognized infection had already accomplished. The medical connection between what the Lyme disease did to his brain and the Lewy body dementia that eventually killed him is important to understand, even in plain terms. When the bacteria responsible for neurological Lyme disease crosses the blood-brain barrier, it triggers a sustained inflammatory response. Immune cells called microglia, which normally protect the brain, become overactivated and begin damaging the neural networks they are supposed to defend. Blood vessels inside the brain become inflamed in a process called cerebral vasculitis. The signals between neurons begin to break down. And this state of chronic internal inflammation can accelerate the kind of protein misfolding that causes neurodegenerative disease. For Seaver specifically, the sustained inflammation from years of unrecognized neurological infection is described as having acted as a major catalyst accelerating the progression of the Lewy body dementia that would eventually claim his life. 2 diseases, separated by decades, working in sequence toward one conclusion. He kept showing up in his vineyard through all of it. Even after the 2013 diagnosis, even after doctors had told him directly that the damage to his brain was permanent and the trajectory was only going to in one direction, Seaver continued to walk his rows every morning, his clippers in his pocket, his dogs alongside him through the vines. The same quiet refusal to give ground discipline that had defined the mound at Shea Stadium was now applied to the hillside above Calistoga against an opponent that could not be prepared for or studied or outworked by any amount of effort. He did not quit, not beat the disease by showing up in the vineyard every day. But he showed up anyway because that was the only way he had ever known how to live. By 2017, those closest to him could see the change clearly in a way that could no longer be explained by a bad day or a difficult morning or the ordinary variability of a man getting older. The decline was visible and consistent and moving in one direction. Art Shamsky, who had stayed close to Seaver in the years since their playing days together, understood that the window was closing. He organized a trip. He gathered Jerry Koosman, Ron Swoboda, and Bud Harrelson, and the 4 of them flew across the country. They came to Diamond Mountain. They came to see Tom Seaver one more time in the only way that still meant something before the window shut permanently and the chance was gone. Harrelson had prepared the group before they arrived. He and Seaver had been close friends and roommates during their playing years together, Seaver calling him roomie for the rest of their shared lives. Harrelson was himself beginning to struggle with the early stages of Alzheimer's disease by that point, and he understood from close personal experience what cognitive decline looked like and what it asked of everyone around it. He told Shamsky plainly, Seaver would forget things from before. The mind they had all depended on and respected and loved for decades was no longer reliable in the ways it once had been. When they arrived at the vineyard, physical presence of Tom Seaver was still largely intact. He was still recognizable, still himself in his body, still carrying himself with the bearing of the man they had known. But his mind was visibly slipping away from him in real time, right there on the patio where they sat together. He forgot conversations that had happened minutes earlier. He cycled through the same stories without any awareness that he had already told them, arriving at the same points again and again as if each time was the first. The group sat with him and did not correct him. They did not let the discomfort show, because the kindest thing available to them was to simply be present and let him enjoy the afternoon exactly as he was experiencing it. They drank wine from his own bottles, wine grown on the land he had worked with his own hands for 20 years. They talked about 1969. They talked about the season nobody expected them to win, about September of that year when the whole country started paying attention to a team that had been a punchline for its entire existence. They talked about the games that had seemed impossible until they were not, the championship that had started as a joke and ended as the thing that defined all of them forever. They talked about what it had felt like to be young and talented, part of something that nobody had believed in except themselves. They laughed together on that hilltop in Calistoga above the vines that Seaver had planted and tended through years of morning work, and they did it all with the shared unspoken knowledge that this was the last time. That this afternoon, with this wine and these old stories and this man who could not hold the thread of a conversation for more than a few minutes, but whose laughter was still exactly right, was the ending. The final scene of something that had started more than 50 years before on a baseball field in New York, the pitcher who had arrived ready to change everything. Art Shamsky later wrote about the visit in his memoir, After the Miracle. He described the gathering as the lengthiest of goodbyes. Those 4 words are exactly right, and the weight they carry does not diminish with distance or time. The goodbye had not started that afternoon on the hilltop in Calistoga. It had been going on for years already, building through 2012 Lyme relapse and the stage 3 neurological diagnosis in 2013, and quiet, gradual withdrawals from public life as Seaver's capabilities narrowed year by year in ways that were visible to people who had known him. The goodbye had been in progress for at least 5 years before that visit, and it continued for 3 more years after Shamsky and Koosman and Swoboda and Harrelson flew home, patient and relentless and unable to be negotiated with or outworked or refused, until the morning of August 31, 2020, when it was finally and completely finished and the longest goodbye in the history of the Miracle Mets was over. The truth revealed in this entire story is not contained in one single moment of betrayal or one diagnostic failure or one wrong decision by one powerful man. It is 2 distinct tragedies woven through the same life, separated by decades but connected by a single underlying thread. That the forces surrounding Tom Seaver, whether institutional or biological, were never adequate to the man himself, and the gap between what he deserved and what he received was never made right. The first tragedy was constructed entirely by human choices, made by people who had the power and the opportunity to choose differently at every step and consistently did not. Donald Grant spent years treating the most valuable player on his roster as a subordinate who needed to be controlled rather than a professional who deserved partnership and respect. He enforced maximum pay cuts when the rules allowed it, without sentiment or acknowledgement of what the player had already given the organization. He resisted every contract request with termination of someone who believed that management authority over athletes was a natural and permanent right rather than a negotiated arrangement that players were now learning to challenge and draw from. He built an organizational culture in which a newspaper columnist felt comfortable putting a player's wife's name in print in order to destroy a contract agreement and drive the player to demand a trade. Whether that column was directly coordinated from within the front office, or whether it grew organically from an environment in which management's interests and the columnist's perspective had aligned for so many years that no explicit coordination was necessary, the culture that produced it belongs to Grant. Seaver left. Grant's famous prediction about Dan Norman became a permanent record of how completely and catastrophically management had miscalculated the value of what it had given away. He was gone from the organization a year. The franchise he had helped damage spent the better part of a decade in the consequences of that damage. The fans who had watched Seaver build the Mets into something real carried the loss much longer than Grant was ever required to. The second tragedy was built by biology and by a diagnostic failure that arrived too late to matter. The Lyme disease contracted in a Connecticut garden in 1991 was not anyone's negligence or miscalculations, the kind of misfortune that happens to people who spend time outdoors in certain parts of the country. The failure to identify the neurological progression of that infection during its months of active and unrecognized advancement in 2012 and into 2003 was the kind of failure that leaves a permanent mark. By the time the stage 3 neurological diagnosis came, doctors could describe exactly what had been lost inside Seaver's brain. They could not describe any path to getting it back because no such path existed. The delay had cost him the only window in which early intervention might have changed his trajectory. And the chronic brain inflammation from years of unrecognized infection established the conditions that accelerated the Lewy body dementia through its stages. 2 diseases in sequence across 30 years toward one ending. Gary Cohen said there was a light in the sadness when Tom Seaver passed. He said Seaver had been a light that everyone would look to, had represented their childhood, had been something fixed and reliable in the way that great athletes sometimes become the people who grow up watching them. That framing survives everything in this story. It outlasts M. Donald Grant and Dick Young and the Midnight Massacre and the contract disputes and the plantation mentality and the years of insulting negotiations that strip the goodwill out of a relationship between a franchise and the player who built it It outlasts the Lyme disease contracted while working in a garden and the delayed diagnosis that arrived months too late to prevent irreversible damage and the chronic brain inflammation that accelerated the progression of a neurodegenerative disease through its stages across years of quiet decline. It outlasts all of it. The light was in the 311 wins and the 3 Cy Young Awards and the 19 strikeouts and the Hall of Fame plaque and the rows he walked every morning with his dogs and the wine he poured for his teammates on the last afternoon they ever spent together. The light was in Keith Hernandez writing a single word when no other word was adequate to the moment. Tears. Tom Seaver deserved better from the franchise that owed everything to him and let him go over a newspaper column and a management culture that fused dominance with leadership. He deserved a front office that understood what it had, one that valued the man as much as the wins he produced, one that would have protected the agreement DeRoulet made instead of allowing it to be collapsed by a columnist the next morning. He deserved the kind of institutional loyalty that matches the individual loyalty he had shown across a decade of difficult negotiations in which he never stopped performing at the highest level, even while arguing for fair pay. He deserved better from the medical timeline that could not identify what was happening inside his brain, while there was still a chance to protect him from the worst of it. He deserved better from both of the forces that failed him, and he never received what he deserved from either one. Most people who ever watched him pitch understood the first part of that, even without the full picture. Now you have both. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment below about what you already knew going in and what changed for you by the end of it. Tell us your memory of Tom Seaver, the game you watched, the moment that stayed with you. Subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive, and give this video a like so more people can find the real story of the man who made the Mets matter and deserved far better than the forces that worked against him across his lifetime ever gave him.
What's behind you? Think about what's ahead of you, because right now we're not in too bad a situation. We can win this ballgame. We're right even with these people again, and if I worry too much about what happened yesterday, it's not going to do me too much good. So I'm just going to be positive as I can, and maybe I can help the club with my bat in the last couple of games. That's what I'm hoping.
The tragic truth about Bill Freehan hit the whole baseball world even harder when Mickey Lolich died in early 2026, because that death did not just mark the end of one man's life. It closed the final chapter on one of the most famous batteries in the history of the game, Lolich and Freehan, the left-hander and the catcher, the two men who stood at the center of one of the greatest moments in Detroit sports history. And when Lolich was gone, that famous image came rushing back to everyone who had ever loved the Tigers. The image of Mickey Lolich leaping through the air, arms wide open, soaring right into Bill Freehan's chest after the final out of the 1968 World Series. Two men, one moment, a city saved. But the tragic truth is that the man who caught that leap, the man who held that moment together, paid a price that no championship ring can make right. I'm Mason, and this is Baseball Icon. If Bill Freehan's name still means something to you, use the hype feature right now and give this video some hype while we bring his story back. The stories like this one deserve to be remembered, and your hype helps more people find it. Bill Freehan was born in Detroit, Michigan on November 29, 1941. He was the oldest of 4 kids. His mother was Helen. His father was Ashley. He grew up in Royal Oak, Michigan, not far from the city where he would one day become a legend. He was a kid who loved sports the way kids in that era loved everything, which was with every ounce of energy they had. He played in the neighborhood. He played on sand lots. He played wherever there was room to run and throw and compete. And in those early years, nobody could have told you that this boy from Royal Oak was going to grow up to be one of the best catchers in the history of American League Baseball. The story of how he became a catcher is one of those small accidents that turns out to matter more than almost anything else in a person's life. During a Little League game, the team's regular catcher did not show up. Someone had to go behind the plate. Bill Freehan, who had been playing shortstop, walked back there and put on the gear. That was it. That was the moment. He never really left that position again. Even in those early Little League days, the position came with a cost. One of his first home plate moments involved a violent collision with a kid named Willie Horton. Willie Horton, the same Willie Horton who would one day become his teammate, his friend, and the man whose throw home would set up the most important defensive play of the 1968 World Series. That early collision was almost like a warning from the future, a sign of what this life behind the plate was going to look like. But Bill Freehan was not the kind of person who walked away from warnings. He was the kind of person who caught the ball and held on. When he was 14 years old, his family moved to St. Petersburg, Florida. His father had purchased a mobile home development down there, and the family followed. The Freehan enrolled at Bishop Barry High School, and he became exactly what you would expect from a kid with that much natural ability. He was a star in baseball. He was a star in basketball. He was a star in football. He was the kind of multi-sport athlete that coaches dream about finding, the kind of kid who makes every team better just by being on it. During his freshman year at Bishop Barry, he met a girl named Patricia Ann O'Brien. He would later marry her. She would later be the person who spent years caring for him at home when the man the world knew as a tough, unbreakable catcher could no longer care for himself. Every summer during high school, Freehand came back to Detroit to play sandlot baseball. His defensive skills were already extraordinary. A Detroit Tiger scout named Luis D'Annunzio watched him play one summer and made a statement that stayed with people for a long time. He said that Bill Freehand at 15 years old was the finest sandlot catcher he had ever scouted. Not one of the finest. The finest? That kind of praise does not come easily from a man who has watched hundreds of players. It comes when you're watching someone special. The after high school graduation in 1959, Freehand had his sights on the University of Notre Dame. The Notre Dame was a natural choice for a devout Catholic kid from a strong family who also happened to be one of the best young athletes in the state of Florida. But Notre Dame had a condition. They wanted him to choose one sport, just one. Football or baseball? Pick one and commit. That was the deal. Bill Freehand did not like that deal. He turned to the University of Michigan instead. The Michigan offered him a dual athletic scholarship, meaning he could play football and baseball both. He could do what he loved without being forced to give half of himself away before he even got started. So he packed up and headed to Ann Arbor. And what he did there set the foundation for everything that came next. At Michigan, Freehand played football as a linebacker and an end under head coach Bump Elliott. He played with the kind of physical toughness that the position demands. He ran downfield, he delivered and absorbed hits. He competed against college players who were trying to make it to the professional level. This was not flag football. This was real contact, real impact, real force. At a time when helmets were not built anything like what players wear today. Nobody was talking about head trauma back then. The nobody was measuring the small hits that did not knock a player unconscious but still rattled the brain inside the skull. Those hits just happened. They were part of the game. And Freehand took them over and over, season after season. Because that is what tough athletes did on the baseball field. He was something different entirely. He was a catcher who seemed born for the job. He was smart, he was strong, and he could hit. In the 1961 baseball season, he helped lead the Michigan Wolverines to a Big Ten championship. In conference play that year, he batted .585. That number is almost hard to believe. More than half the time he stepped to the plate in Big Ten games, he got a hit. That kind of season gets attention fast. The Detroit Tigers came calling. His father negotiated the contract, and the Tigers agreed to a signing bonus of $125,000. That was serious money. But his father had a condition of his own. The Bill Freehand would not see $1 of that bonus until he finished his college degree. His father believed in education, and no amount of baseball money was going to change that. Freehand agreed, he signed the contract, started his professional career, and kept taking classes during the off seasons until he walked across that stage and earned his history degree in 1966 with a 3.1 grade point average. That ability to work towards something long-term while doing something hard in the present tells you a lot about the kind of man Bill Freehand was. His path through the minor leagues was quick. The Tigers sent him to Duluth Superior in the Class C Northern League. He hit .343 in 30 games. Then he moved to Knoxville. Then he got a short call-up to Detroit in September, and he collected 4 hits in 10 at-bats. In 1962, he spent the year with Denver in the American Association and showed the combination of strong defense and reliable offense that had scouts so excited. By 1963, he was in Detroit for good, and by 1964, the whole American League knew his name. That year, Bill Freehand hit .300. That might not sound like a stunning number until you understand what it meant. He became the first Tigers catcher to hit .300 since Mickey Cochran did it back in 1935. Nearly 30 years had passed without a Tigers catcher reaching that mark, and Freehand got there in his first full season as the starter. He committed only 7 errors across 141 games. He caught 517 straight innings without a mistake. He earned his first All-Star selection that year, and it was the first of 11. The 11 times the American League voted Bill Freehand into the All-Star game, he also won 5 Gold Gloves, which go to the best defensive player at each position every year. His manager, Charlie Dressen, said something about Freehand that stuck. Dressen called him the spiritual leader of the clubhouse. Not just a good player, not just a defensive standout, the spiritual leader, the heartbeat of the group. Veteran pitchers trusted him with their arms and their careers. When they climbed on the mound, they knew that the man crouching behind the plate was the smartest baseball mind in the stadium. They threw what he called. They trusted his judgment. That is a rare kind of respect, and Freehand earned it by being right more often than anyone else. The offensive numbers across his career sometimes get dismissed because people look at the raw totals and compare them to numbers from other eras, but that is not how you judge a player. Freehand's prime years fell during the second dead ball era of the late 1960s, when pitchers dominated baseball so completely that the league eventually had to lower the mound just to give hitters a fair chance. Compared to what every other hitter was doing during those same years, Freehand was elite. He was one of the best offensive catchers in the game, and he was also one of the best defensive catchers in the game, and that combination is what makes a player player truly great. But all of that was building toward 1968. That was the year everything came together. That was the year Bill Freehan reached the very top of the mountain. The 1968 Detroit Tigers were a team that a whole city poured its hope into. The Detroit had suffered through one of the worst riots in American history the summer before, and that team carried the weight of a grieving city on its back. Bill Freehan was at the center of all of it. In the regular season, he set career highs in several categories. He hit 25 home runs, he drove in 84 runs, he was hit by pitches 24 times, which tells you something about both his toughness and how seriously pitchers took him as a hitter. At the end of the year, when they voted for the American League's most valuable player, Freehan finished second. The only man who beat him was his own teammate, Denny McLain, who had one of the most dominant pitching seasons in baseball history that year. Finishing second to that season is no embarrassment. It is an honor. That year, Freehan also cemented something with Mickey Lolich that no battery in baseball history had ever done before. Together, Freehan and Lolich started 324 games as a battery. That is a major league record. 324 times, Mickey Lolich walked the mound knowing that Bill Freehan was going to be behind the plate, calling the game, reading the hitters, and being the foundation that every good pitcher needs. When you spend that much time with one pitcher, you learn every small thing about how he works. You know when his fastball is moving and when it is not. You know when to push him and when to slow him down. You know the game inside the game, and Freehan knew all of it. The World Series that fall was against the Louis Cardinals, the reigning champions, a team loaded with talent and experience. The Tigers fell behind 3-1. They were one loss away from going home empty-handed, and then something happened. The Game 5 will be remembered in Detroit for as long as baseball is played there. The Cardinals had a runner named Lou Brock, one of the fastest players in the game. The Julian Javier singled, and Brock tried to score from second base. Willie Horton, playing left field, fielded the ball and threw it home. And there was Bill Freehan blocking the plate with his foot, waiting. Brock came in hard. He did not slide. He tried to bulldoze through. Freehan held his ground. He held the ball. He held on through everything Brock threw at him, and the umpire called Brock out. The play shifted the entire momentum of the series. The Tigers came back and won that game, and then they won Game 6, and then they faced the Cardinals in Game 7. Game 7 was Mickey Lolich against Bob Gibson. The Lolich won 4-1. It remains one of the great individual pitching performances in World Series history. And at the end of that game, when Tim McCarver hit a foul pop-up into the air, it was Bill Freehan who caught it. He squeezed the ball in his glove, and the Detroit Tigers were World Series champions for the first time in 23 years. The photo that came out of that moment shows Mickey Lolich running and jumping, arms flying outward, launching himself into the air with pure joy, landing right in Bill Freehan's arms. That image defined both men. It defined their partnership. What Detroit baseball meant in 1968, and for a long time, it seemed like it defined Bill Freehan himself. But the play at the plate in Game 5 also shows something else. It shows what Freehan had to do to be great. He had to stand there and absorb the collision. He had to plant his body and take the blow and hold on. That moment of glory was also a moment of damage, and the damage was adding up in ways nobody could see. In 1969, Freehan kept a detailed diary of the entire season. He worked with editors Steve Gelman and Dick Schaap to shape it into a book, and in 1970, that book was published under the title Behind the Mask, an Inside Baseball Diary. Before the book came out, Sports Illustrated published excerpts from it. Those excerpts lit a fire. In the book, Freehan wrote about how Tigers management had allowed Denny McLain to break team rules while everyone else was expected to follow them. McLain was the star, and stars got different treatment. Freehan said so, clearly and in print. The response inside the Detroit clubhouse was not kind. Players who felt named or implied were angry. Fans who had worshipped McLain were unhappy with Freehan for saying it. There was booing. There was a rift. There was a chill in a clubhouse that had been warm just a year before, when they were all celebrating together. Freehan believed in honesty. He believed in the truth. But the truth came with a cost, and that cost stuck to him for a while. Then his body started giving him a different kind of warning. In 1970, severe spinal problems stopped him cold. The pain had actually started years before. Back in 1965, he suffered a serious base running injury that slowly created damage in his lower back. By 1970, that damage had reached a point where he was experiencing numbness in his legs. The numbness, his legs were going numb. That is not a minor issue. That is your body telling you that something is badly wrong. On September 2, 1970, Bill Freehan had major surgery on his 5th lumbar vertebra. The surgeons performed a spinal bone graft. People close to the team were genuinely afraid that his career was over. A catcher who cannot feel his legs properly cannot do what catchers have to do. The surgery was serious, the recovery was long, and nobody knew what the other side was going to look like. What it looked like was remarkable. In 1971, under manager Billy Martin, Freehan came back and led all American League catchers in batting average, finishing at 277. He hit 21 home runs. He drove in 71 runs. He started started the All-Star game. On August 9th of that year, he hit 3 home runs in a single game, one of the most physically demanding positions in sports, after major spinal surgery, and he came back better than almost anyone expected. But the comeback did not undo the damage. It only showed how much pain Freehan was willing to carry without complaint. The injury was still there in the background. The hits were still adding up. The wear was still building, one foul tip at a time, one plate collision at a time, one season at a time. In 1972, the wear showed up in a new place. Freehan fractured his right thumb while tagging out Carl Yastrzemski. He played through it in the postseason. That decision had consequences. The Oakland Athletics were watching him, and they knew his throwing was compromised. In the American League Championship Series, Oakland stole 7 bases against him. 7. His arm was not right, and they took advantage of every moment of it. He played hurt because that is what he had always done. But playing hurt in October against the Oakland Athletics was a different kind of hard. In 1973, his relationship with Billy Martin turned sour. Martin decided to platoon Freehan, meaning he would not play every day. He would share the catcher's job based on matchups. Freehan hated it. He had been a daily starter for most of his career. He had carried this team through a championship run, and now he was being told to sit some games out. His batting average fell to 234 that year, and the frustration behind that number was real. In 1974, under a new manager, Ralph Houck, Freehan found something again. The Houck used him in a hybrid role between catcher and first base, which took some physical pressure off his body. The freedom seemed to help. He hit 297 with 18 home runs. It was a strong season, a reminder that he still had something left. In 1975, he was selected to his final All-Star game. In 1976, he played his last season in the major leagues, and at the end of that year, the Tigers let him go. He was 34 years old. The Toronto Blue Jays, a brand new expansion franchise, came to him with an offer. They wanted him to be their designated hitter. He would not have to catch. He would not have to block the plate. He would just hit, which was still something he could do. The deal would have extended his career. It might have added enough home runs and hits to seriously help his Hall of Fame case. He said no. He chose to retire as a Detroit Tiger, the only team he had ever played for. He later said that playing in Toronto could have added to his career numbers and given the Hall of Fame voters more to consider. But his identity was in Detroit. His life was in Detroit, and he had already begun building a business career that was going well. He made a choice, and he stood by it. And that says everything you need to know about the man. After baseball, Freehan moved into the automotive industry, which makes perfect sense for someone who built his adult life in and around Detroit. He co-founded a company called Freehan Bochie, a manufacturer's representative firm that worked with the automobile industry. He also served as president of a separate automotive manufacturer's representative agency. He was not just a former ballplayer trying to use his name. He built real professional knowledge in a competitive industry and made it work. He also helped a former teammate build something meaningful. Hank Aguirre, who had pitched for the Tigers, wanted to start a manufacturing company called Mex Industries. The company was located near Tiger Stadium, and it hired many workers from Detroit's Mexican Town neighborhood, a Latino community that did not always get the opportunities it deserved. Freehan provided an important early investment to help Aguirre get the business off the ground. It was a quiet act of generosity toward a former teammate and toward a community, and it is the kind of thing that does not make headlines, but says a great deal about character. In 1984 and 1985, Freehan worked as a color commentator on Tigers television broadcasts. He was good at it, as you might expect from someone who had spent his career reading pitchers and hitters and understanding every small part of the game. In 1989, he returned to his college home and was named head baseball coach at the University of Michigan. He held that job from 1990 through 1995. In 1994, he led the Wolverines to a second-place finish in the Big Ten Conference playoffs. He was not just showing up for a title. He was coaching with purpose. From 2002 to 2005, he came back to the Tigers organization as a coaching instructor and catching coordinator. He worked with young prospects. He passed on everything he knew about defense, about game calling, about mental toughness and focus behind the plate. One of those young prospects was a kid named Blaze Salter, though at that point in time, Salter was not yet a professional player. He was still a child, still growing up, still watching his grandfather and learning what it meant to love this game. Outside of baseball, Freehan gave his time to causes that mattered to him. He supported Special Olympics. He supported the March of Dimes. He was involved with Wirtz Warriors and Catholic Charities. He had grown up in a devout Catholic home, and his faith stayed with him throughout his life. He used whatever platform he had to help people who needed it. This part of the story is warmer. It is the picture of a man who built a full life after baseball, who served his community, who coached young men, who supported his former teammates, and who gave his time and his name to people who were struggling. But there's a shadow over all of it, because the viewer already knows what is coming, because the body that carried all of this greatness was already carrying something else too. The Bill Freehan played football as a linebacker and quarterback at the University of Michigan during a time when helmet technology was not built to protect the brain from repeated impacts. Every collision on a football field sent force through his skull. Every hit that did not knock him unconscious still rattled his brain against the inside of his head. Those are called subconcussive impacts. impacts. And researchers have learned in the years since that they accumulate. They add up slowly over time, doing damage that does not show up right away, but builds quietly in the background. Then came 15 years of professional baseball, catching 1,581 major league games. Every single foul tip that rang off his mask sent a small wave of force into his head and neck. Every plate collision, every time a base runner came in hard and did not bother to slide, sent force through his body. He was hit by pitches 114 times in his career, which means 114 times a baseball traveling at high speed struck his body while he was standing at the plate. The catcher masks used in the 1960s and 1970s did not have the modern engineering that today's gear has. They were not designed to spread impact across a wide surface area. They took the force and transferred it directly into the face and head of the man wearing them. His family later said they feared that all of those impacts, all of that repeated trauma to the head across decades of contact sports, may have contributed to what happened to him later. They were careful about it. They did not say it was a certainty. The science of brain injury is still developing, and no doctor stood up and gave a clinical diagnosis connecting his career to his decline. But the fear was real, and the question was real, and the pattern was hard to ignore. He was not alone among his championship teammates in facing neurological disease late in life. A direct clinical link between McAuliffe's injuries and his dementia was never proven, but his story, like Freehand's, made people think about what those years of playing through contact had cost. Around 2007, Bill Freehand told his family that something was not quite right. He could not fully explain it. He just knew something had changed. The something was off inside his own mind, and he could feel it even if he could not name it. That was the beginning. Over the next decade, things got worse. Slowly at first, then faster, then in ways that no amount of preparation could fully soften. He had always loved to take long walks in the woods near his home in Petoskey, Michigan, with his dogs by his side. He had loved riding his bike on long trips to Charlevoix. Those things disappeared. The disease took them from him one at a time, quietly and without asking permission. By late 2018, the man who had once blocked the plate against Lou Brock and held on through everything thrown at him was completely bedridden. He could not walk. He could not speak. He could not feed himself. His wife, Pat, sat with him and talked to him and loved him, and she could no longer know for certain if he understood her. She could not know if he was still there in any way she could reach. The Pat Freehand was a registered nurse. She used everything she knew to care for him at home, which is where she wanted him to be, surrounded by family and familiar things. She placed his hospital bed in the center of their family room, facing a window that looked out over Walloon Lake. The water was right there. The view was quiet and beautiful and peaceful. On the mantle behind him sat his 1968 World Series trophy, the one from that great season, the one from that championship. On his hand, he wore his World Series ring. Family worked with Hospice of Michigan. A registered nurse came twice a week to check his vital signs and manage his medications. A home care aide came 5 days a week to help with hygiene and positioning and basic comfort. A hospice physician came every 6 weeks. A hospice pastor came once a month. A social worker came once a month. Pat managed all of it, coordinated all of it, and was there every day. This is the cost that did not appear in any box score. This is the part of the story that does not fit on a baseball card. The man who was once one of the best catchers in the American League, who was once the spiritual leader of a World Series champion, who was once the man whose arms held Mickey Lolich after the final out, could not speak or walk or feed himself. The game he gave everything to could not give that back. His grandson, Blaze Salter, was watching all of it. The Salter had grown up around baseball, around the Tigers, and around the shadow of his grandfather's legacy. In 2015, the Detroit Tigers drafted him in the 31st round. He played catcher and first base, the same positions his grandfather had played, for the same franchise his grandfather had defined. There was something beautiful in that. But there was also something sobering, because Salter had a front row seat to what the game had taken from Bill Freehand. In his time in the minor leagues, Salter suffered 2 concussions within 8 months. The first happened in Lakeland, Florida. An inside fastball struck the side of his batting helmet. The impact was violent enough to produce symptoms immediately. Headaches that would not quit, and a sensitivity to light and sound that made daily life genuinely painful. He went through the recovery process, worked his way back, and then it happened again. The second concussion came in a game with Double-A Erie. A base runner collided with him while he was reaching for a throw at first base. The collision hit him hard, the same symptoms returned, the headaches, the sensitivity to light and sound. His body was giving him the same message it had given him before, louder this time. After completing his rehabilitation and being cleared to return to play, Blaze Salter made a decision. In June 2018, at 24 years old, he retired from professional baseball. He was not forced out. He was not told his career was over. over by a doctor. He chose to stop. He said that he was afraid a third concussion would cause permanent damage to his brain. He had seen what happened to his grandfather. He had watched that slow, terrible decline up close year after year, and he was not willing to roll the dice on his own mind. Salter had a sociology degree from Michigan State University. He moved into medical sales. He chose his long-term health over his baseball dream, and the reason he was able to make that choice clearly was because of what watching Bill Freehan had taught him. Freehan's story became more than history for that family. It became a warning that shaped a young man's future. William Ashley Freehan died on August 19, 2021 at his home in Walloon Lake, Michigan. He was 79 years old. He had fought his battle with dementia for many years, and at the end, he was surrounded by the people who loved him and the lake he had always loved to look at. That afternoon, the Detroit Tigers were scheduled to play the Los Angeles Angels at Comerica Park. Before the game began, the team stopped to honor him. They held a moment of silence. Then they showed a 15-minute video tribute on the scoreboard. Photographs and career highlights. Moments from a life lived in the game. 15 minutes. For a man who gave the city so much. That same day, Tigers designated hitter Miguel Cabrera was chasing his 500th career home run and his 3,000th career hit. Two of the rarest milestones in baseball history, and he was close to both of them. And so at Comerica Park that afternoon, there was grief and there was excitement side by side. The past and the present sharing the same space. The way they always do in baseball. The game does not stop for anyone, but it did pause for a moment. And in that pause, it remembered Bill Freehan. His funeral mass was held on August 28, 2021 at St. the Hugo of the Hills Catholic Church in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. His brother-in-law, Father Michael T. O'Brien, celebrated the mass. A memorial mass followed on September 4, 2021 at St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church in Petoskey, close to his home in northern Michigan, close to the lake where he had spent his final years. Then came early 2026. The Mickey Lolich died at 85 years old after a short stay in hospice care. Tributes came from all over the sports world. The people who had watched that 1968 series as children or teenagers or young adults talked about what those Tigers had meant to them. People who had only read about that team came to understand what the fuss was about. And everywhere, people mentioned the same image, Lolich in the air, Freehan catching him. The final out, the championship, the joy. The battery that started 324 games together was now fully gone. The both men had lived full lives, faced hard endings, and left behind legacies that deserved more attention than the Hall of Fame gave them. Freehan's case for Cooperstown never quite got over the line, and that absence remains one of the quieter arguments in baseball history. 11 All-Star selections, 5 Gold Gloves, a World Series championship, a career played during one of the hardest offensive eras the game has ever seen. The numbers, adjusted for that era, are elite. The leadership was real, the impact was undeniable. But what matters most at the end of the story is not a plaque or a voting percentage. What matters is what Bill Freehan actually was. He was a champion. He was a man who grew up in Royal Oak and made it to Detroit and caught every game with everything he had. He was the person crouched behind the plate while the whole city of Detroit was holding its breath, and he did not flinch. He was a husband who found the love of his life during his freshman year of high school and kept her beside him for the rest of his days. He was a father and a grandfather. He was a coach who returned to Michigan and tried to pass on what he knew. He was a businessman who built something real. He was a community member who gave his time to people who needed help. He was a teammate who helped a friend launch a company that hired workers from a community that did not always get a fair shot. He was also a man who paid a price that is hard to look at directly. The toughness that made him great, the willingness to block the plate and take the collision and hold the ball and play through the thumb and play through the back and play through every single thing the game threw at him. That toughness came with a hidden cost that showed up decades later in a hospital bed in a family room facing Walloon Lake. His story is not a simple story. It is not just a celebration, and it is not just a tragedy. It is both things together, which is what most real human stories are. He was one of the best at what he did, and the thing he was best at also wore him down in ways that took everything from him at the end. Baseball may not have fully protected him. The history may not have fully honored him the way he deserved, but Detroit never forgot him. The people who watched him play never forgot him. The family he built never forgot him. And now with Mickey Lolich gone too, the picture of those two men in that moment at the end of the 1968 World Series will keep living, will keep getting shared. The will keeps showing up when people talk about what the game looked like when it was played a certain way by certain men who gave everything they had. That is Bill Freehan. That is his story. That is what happened to him. All of it. The greatness and the cost together. He deserves to be remembered for both. Not just for the ring on his finger, or the trophy on the mantle, or the record-setting battery with Lolich, but for the full picture. A man who gave everything to the game, and a game that took everything it could. He gave it willingly, and he never complained. And that might be the most Detroit thing about him. He was built like that city. The heart on the outside, holding everything together, deserving far more credit than he ever received. Remember his name? Remember what it all cost. Remember Bill Freehan.
Sutton died last night, according to his son Darren. Don spent 23 years in Major League Baseball, mostly with the Dodgers. He was 75. They thought of Don Sutton dying.
Things I remember most were his competitiveness, his durability. He was someone, and I think all of us need, if we're going to be successful, we need to have goals. We need to have people to play off of. Pete Rose and I used to always, have that 200 hit plateau.
Don Sutton died at 75. And the tragic truth is that the clean story everyone told was never the whole story. The world remembered a Hall of Fame pitcher, the A man who won 324 games. The A calm and friendly voice in the broadcast booth for almost 30 years. People called him classy. People called him steady. People called him a hero. All of that was real. Behind the kind words was a much harder man and a story that baseball did not always want to tell out loud. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icons. He had passed away on January 19th, 2021. He had fought cancer for a long time, and he kept most of that fight private, away from the public eye, almost to the very end. The public mostly saw the polished version of his life. And if stories like this deserve more than the clean version, use the hype feature and give this video some hype, because Sutton's real story gets much darker from here. When he died, the tributes came fast. Teams honored him. League leaders praised him. They talked about his durability. They talked about his 3 decades of broadcasting. They talked about a man who showed up year after year and did his job better than almost anyone. It was all true. He really was that durable. He really was that respected. He was a Hall of Fame pitcher who won 324 games and struck out 3,574 batters. He was a familiar voice to a whole generation of Braves fans. But here's the thing about tributes. They are written to comfort, not to explain. They focus on the milestone. They focus on the trophies. They pick the nice stories and quietly skip the rest. That is what happened with Sutton. The kind words told people what he achieved. They did not tell people who he really was. Because the tributes left out the fights, they left out the accusations, they left out the cold, self-interested choices that followed him for years. The problem was never that Sutton lacked greatness. The problem was that his greatness came wrapped in conflict, came with calculation. It came with friction. It came with a long list of things baseball preferred to leave out of the highlight reel. The clean version made him simple. The real version was anything but. To understand the real Sutton, you have to start with the team that built his image. You have to start with the Los Angeles Dodgers and the story they told the world about themselves. The 1970s, the Dodgers sold a beautiful idea. They called it the Dodger family. The manager, Tommy Lasorda, pushed it hard. He spoke about brotherhood. He spoke about unity. He even talked about the big Dodger in the sky like the team was something close to a church. It was a clean, warm, friendly picture. Fans loved it. The sponsors loved it. It looked perfect. It was the kind of story that sells tickets and sells products. The team wanted one story for the public, and they worked hard to keep that story neat. Sutton did not buy it. He was direct. He was rational. He thought the whole family act was fake, and he was not shy about saying so. He even called the religious talk sacrilegious. He was not a man who liked pretending. He looked at the polished image and saw a sales pitch, not a brotherhood. And in a clubhouse built on pretending, that made him a problem. The A man who refuses to play along with the show is a danger to the show. The face of that clean image was Steve Garvey. Garvey was the crown jewel. He looked like the perfect American star. He was a family man. He had an Eagle Scout image. He had big commercial deals and a high public profile. He was the man teams put on posters. He was exactly what the Dodgers wanted to sell. But Sutton and some of his teammates saw something hollow under that shine. They thought the image was built on purpose, like a product. So Sutton spoke up. He gave an interview to a writer named Thomas Boswell of the Washington Post. And in that interview, Sutton said something that broke the spell. He said the real most valuable player on the team was not Garvey. It was the outfielder Reggie Smith. He said Smith was not a facade. He said Smith was not a Madison Avenue image. Think about what that really meant. Sutton was not just praising one player over another. He was attacking the team's whole sales pitch. He was telling the world that the clean face of the franchise was not even the most important man on it. He was saying the marketing did not match the reality on the field. In a sport that loves its heroes, that is a dangerous thing to say. The team wanted one story, the story of its golden boy. Sutton handed the public a different story, and he backed it with truth. And here's the uncomfortable part. Sutton was right. By the simple numbers, Garvey looked huge. He piled up hits and runs and big batting averages season after season. Look at his peak years, and you see why fans worshipped him. In 1974, he played 156 games, collected 200 hits, hit 21 home runs, drove in 111 runs, and batted .312. In 1975, he played 160 games and got 210 hits with a .319 average. In 1976, another 200 hits and a .317 average. In 1977, he hit 33 home runs and drove in 115 runs. In 1978, 1978, the very year of the fight, he had 202 hits, 113 runs batted in, and a .316 average. On paper, that is a superstar. That is exactly the kind of line that goes on a poster. But the deeper numbers told a different story. The raw totals were loud, yet they hid a quieter truth. In 1977 and 1978, Garvey's on-base plus slugging was good but not elite. Reggie Smith's was far better over that same stretch. Smith got on base more often. Smith did more damage with each swing. Garvey loved to swing at almost everything, and that free swinging style cost the team. Over those 2 seasons, Garvey grounded into 22 more double plays than Smith did. That is 22 extra rallies he helped kill, and when you add it all up into one final value number, wins above replacement, Smith was worth more to the Dodgers than Garvey was. The unheralded man was the better player. The marketed man was not. So when Sutton said it out loud, he was not lying. He was just breaking the rules of the show. And in baseball, breaking the rules of the show can be more dangerous than being wrong. The tension finally exploded on August 20th, 1978. The place was Shea Stadium in New York. The visiting clubhouse there was famous for being small, cramped, and ugly. People called it a dump. It was the worst possible place for 2 angry men to collide. The day before, Sutton had pitched well. He beat the Mets 8-4. So this was not about a bad game. This was about words. Garvey cared deeply about his reputation. He cared about his endorsements and his clean name. So he walked up to Sutton and asked him a direct question. He asked if he had been misquoted. Sutton did not back down. He confirmed the quotes. He had said it, and he meant it. And right there, the conversation began to fall apart. Garvey had a habit that drove Sutton crazy. He liked to point his finger straight at a man's chest. He did it to Sutton. And Sutton, already irritated, grabbed the finger. From there, it turned ugly fast. The 2 traded personal insults. The insults got nasty. Some of them were aimed at Garvey's wife, Cindy. There was no coming back from that. Then it became physical. Sutton leaped at Garvey. He flung him into a row of lockers. The 2 men went down hard. They clawed at each other, threw wild punches. In that tiny, junky room, there was nowhere to escape. There were no soft places to land. It was raw and personal, and this was not a staged shove for the cameras. This was 2 grown men trying to hurt each other. Teammates had to break it up. The Reggie Smith, Rick Monday, Davey Lopes, and Bill Russell rushed in and pulled the 2 apart. It took several men to stop it. The general manager, Al Campanis, led Garvey away into the trainer's room. Garvey was bleeding. He came out of it with a scratched face and a red eye. Sutton came out with a bruised cheek. The perfect Dodger family had just beaten each other up in a dirty visiting clubhouse. The clean image was sitting on the floor with a bloody face. The most telling moment was not the punches. It was the reaction. When someone shouted that the fight should be stopped before they killed each other, the catcher, Joe Ferguson, gave a chilling answer. He simply said, "Good." That one word said more than any tribute ever could. It showed how deep the anger ran inside that so-called family. And then comes the part that should sit strangely with you. The Dodgers won that day anyway. They beat the Mets again. Garvey himself singled, drove in a run, and scored the tying run. Ferguson doubled in the go-ahead run. The same men who had just tried to hurt each other in a cramped clubhouse walked out onto the field and worked together to win the game. They could hate each other in private and still perform in public. Think about what that takes. It takes the ability to bury real anger and put on a show the moment the gates open. That is not a sign of a healthy family. That is the opposite. It is a sign of professionals who had learned to hide the truth behind the final score, and who did it so well that fans never knew a war had just been fought in the room next door. So the clean image cracked wide open in private that day. But the cracks stayed hidden from the public for the most part, and that was only the loud, blunt side of Sutton, the side that throws punches. The next story is darker because it moves away from open fights and into something much quieter. It moves into the cold choices a man makes when no one is watching. Move forward to 1987. Sutton was now with the California Angels. So was a pitcher named John Candelaria. And that season, Candelaria was arrested twice for driving under the influence of alcohol. The second arrest came on May 14, 1987, after the team flew back to California from a road trip to Detroit. The next spring, in 1988, Candelaria had been traded to the New York Yankees. And from there, he made a serious accusation. He said Sutton had tipped off the police before that second arrest. He said Sutton helped set him up. There were 2 ways to read it. Sutton said he made the report out of concern. He said he was worried about Candelaria's safety. That is one version. Candelaria saw it another way. He believed Sutton acted out of pure self-interest. He believed Sutton did it to protect himself. To understand why this cut so deep, you have to know what Candelaria had already been through. On Christmas Day in 1984, his 18-month-old son fell into a swimming pool. The boy spent 11 months in a coma. He died in November 1985. That is a level of pain most people people cannot imagine. Losing a baby is a wound that never fully heals. It left Candelaria fragile and very protective of his private life. After his first arrest, he told reporters his drinking was nobody's business but his own on his days off. This was a man carrying grief that he could not put down. So when a teammate seemed to make his troubles worse, it hit a very tender place. Now place Sutton's situation next to that pain, and the picture gets cold. At the start of 1987, Sutton was 42 years old. In baseball years, that is ancient for a pitcher. He was pitching badly. He had a record of 0 wins and 3 losses. His earned run average sat at 7.20 in his first 3 starts. That is poor by any standard. He was close to being released. He was running out of road and he knew it. Candelaria, on the other hand, was the better pitcher. He was a real threat to Sutton's spot in the rotation. The only one of them could be sure of a job, and the younger, healthier arm was winning that quiet contest. And then the police report happened. After it, Candelaria ended up on the disabled list. Then he went into a rehabilitation program. And just like that, a better pitcher was gone from the rotation. The threat disappeared. Sutton kept his job. The research does not prove that Sutton did it only for himself, but it shows why the accusation was so hard for some people to brush away. The timing was ugly. The benefit to Sutton was clear. There was one more detail that made it worse. Sutton and Candelaria lived only a quarter of a mile apart, yet Sutton never reached out to him during rehab. He never reached out after the trade. For a man who said he acted out of concern, that silence was loud. The call was real. This was not just an angry teammate making things up. The Angels manager Gene Mauch later confirmed that Sutton had indeed phoned the police. The Maua also said he disagreed with how the whole thing was handled, so whatever Sutton's true reason was, the action itself was never in doubt. He made the call. The struggling 42-year-old pitcher, fighting to keep his job, made a call that removed a better and younger pitcher from his path. Lays out the timing, the benefit, and the silence, and it lets you decide for yourself what kind of man makes that choice. And this was not a one-time thing. Sutton's habit of putting himself first showed up again and again near the end of his career. The Candelaria story was not a strange accident. It fit who he had always been. In 1988, a Dodgers executive named Fred Clare publicly accused Sutton of breaking league rules. He said Sutton had talked about a front office job with the Houston Astros while he was still under contract as a Dodgers player. In plain terms, the team felt he was lining up his next job with a rival while he was supposed to be loyal to them. Sutton waved it off. He said it was just a casual chat at a game, nothing serious. Maybe it was, but it fit a pattern that teams had learned to expect from him. Years before that, when Sutton actually played for the Astros, he had clashed with the general manager, Al Rosen. Sutton had openly said he wanted to finish his career on the West Coast to be near his family. On its own, that sounds harmless and even sweet, but Rosen did not hear it that way. He heard a player using public pressure to steer his own future, and it stung Rosen for a personal reason. Rosen had retired early from his own playing days to focus on his family. So when Sutton turned family into public leverage, Rosen took it as a personal insult, almost a mockery of his own choices. Over and over, Sutton put his own wants first. And over, it caused friction with the men who ran his teams. He was loyal to one thing above all, and that thing was Don Sutton. So far, we have seen a man who fought teammates and worked the angles. But the biggest shadow over his career is something else entirely. It is the thing opponents whispered about for more than 20 years. It is the question of whether his 324 wins were truly clean. Here is the simple version of the accusation. People believed Sutton doctored the baseball. That means he changed the ball on purpose to make it move in strange ways. He was accused of scuffing it. He was accused of scratching it. He was accused of putting something on it. The clean baseball flies in fairly steady ways. But a ball with a rough mark or a slick spot behaves differently. It can dip, it can dart, it can break late, right as the batter swings. The pitcher who can make a ball do that has a hidden weapon that no hitter can prepare for. That is why the charge was so serious. It was not a small thing. It struck at whether his success was honest and whether those huge win totals were truly earned or partly stolen. This was not one bitter rival making noise. It was many respected baseball men over many years. The manager Sparky Anderson believed it. The star Lou Brock believed it. So did Bill Buckner. The catcher Ted Simmons of the Cardinals said Sutton's pitches acted like a dry spitball. The spitball is an illegal pitch, so that was a sharp accusation to make out loud. These were not nobodies looking for excuses. These were people who studied the game for a living, who watched Sutton up close, and who came away convinced something was off. Now, to be fair, Sutton had real and rare skill. He threw many different pitches, not just one or two. He had a knuckle curve, a fastball, a slider, a changeup, and a kind of screwball. That is 5 weapons, and most pitchers have far fewer. He was smart about how he used them. He had excellent control, placing the ball almost wherever he wanted. He did not need need to throw the hardest ball in the league to win, because he could outthink hitters instead. The Dodgers coach named Monty Basgall once said Sutton could make the ball talk. That praise was meant to be about pure skill, about a craftsman who knew his trade. The accusations gave those same words a darker second meaning. Maybe the ball was talking, maybe it was just being helped along. And here's what made it all so slippery. Sutton never got angry about the charges, and he never broke down and confessed either. Instead, he turned the whole thing into a joke. When umpires searched him, he played games with them. He left little notes hidden in his uniform pockets and in his glove fingers, just waiting for them to be found during a search. One of those notes read, "You're getting warmer," but it's not here. He was laughing at the very people trying to catch him, turning a serious inspection into a punchline. When someone asked him straight out about using Vaseline, he gave a now famous answer. He said it was not true at all, because Vaseline is made right here in the United States of America. It was clever, it was funny, and it dodged the real question completely without ever saying yes or no. That was the trick, used again and again. Every time the charge got serious, Sutton made everyone laugh instead of think. The humor did not prove him innocent. Not at all. It just made it harder and harder for anyone to keep pushing for a real answer. The laughing room does not demand the truth, but sometimes the humor ran out and the defiance took over. On June 8, 1977, the Dodgers played the Chicago Cubs. Bill Buckner and Cubs manager Herman Franks were sure something was wrong. They demanded that the umpire search Sutton for sandpaper, the kind of rough paper a pitcher could use to scuff a ball. The plate umpire, Bruce Froemming, checked him over. The search found nothing at all. The normal pitcher might have just walked away, glad to be cleared. Sutton did not walk away. He made it worse on purpose. He knelt down on the mound in front of everyone. Then he rubbed the game ball hard into the dirt, almost like a dare, almost like he was taunting the men who had just searched him. When the third base umpire, Dick Stello, asked him to hand over the ball, Sutton did not hand it over politely. He fired it low and hard, skimming it right past Stello and rolling it out into left field. Then, as Froemming marched toward the mound with his face red and his veins showing, Sutton insulted him to his face. He called him a fat, gutless little jackass. He was ejected on the spot. Look at what that scene really shows. The point is not only that Sutton was accused, the point is that Sutton seemed to enjoy it. He turned a clean search into a fight. He treated the umpires like enemies to be mocked instead of officials to respect. The truly innocent man, just cleared by a search, might have stayed calm and let it go. Sutton chose war instead. That choice tells you something the box score never will. The clearest example of his edge came the next year, July 14th, 1978. The Dodgers were at Bush Memorial Stadium in St. Louis. Early in the game, the first base umpire, Jerry Crawford, found a baseball that was heavily marked up. He showed it to the crew chief, Doug Harvey. Later, in the 6th inning, after a batter named Keith Hernandez lined out, Harvey grabbed that ball too. It had the same kind of scuff mark on it. The Harvey did not just shrug. He went to manager Tommy Lasorda and gave a clear warning. He said someone was fooling with the baseball. Then, in the 7th inning, he ejected Sutton. Now here is where Sutton showed his sharpest weapon, and it was not a pitch. The rule was simple. The pitching a defaced ball brought an automatic 10-day suspension. That should have been the end of it. The umpire found the marked ball. The umpire ejected the man. The suspension should have followed, but Sutton and his legal team did something almost no player did. Threatened a huge federal lawsuit. They aimed it at Harvey, at the National League, and at the umpires. They turned a baseball ejection into a legal war. Their argument was clever and cold. They said Harvey could prove the ball was defaced, but he could not prove that Sutton himself had defaced it. He could only prove that Sutton had thrown it. That tiny gap, the gap between throwing a marked ball and marking it, was enough. The league looked at the cost of a giant court fight over who really polices the game, and it blinked. The National League president, Chub Feeney, backed down. He let Sutton off with just a warning. No suspension, no fine, nothing. The penalty that was supposed to be automatic simply vanished. Think about how rare that was. Sutton did not just work the mound. He worked the legal system, and he won. And the contrast with other players is harsh and unfair. Take a pitcher named Rick Honeycutt. He got caught with a thumbtack taped to his finger, a clear and simple piece of evidence. For that, he was suspended for 10 days and fined $250. He faced the rules head on, and the rules won. Sutton, accused for far longer and by far more people, escaped completely clean. One man got caught and paid the price like the system intended. The other man turned the system itself into a weapon and walked away free. Same crime in the eyes of his accusers. Very different endings. By now, Sutton's reputation had become almost a part of the game itself. The searches and the jokes turned into a kind of show that fans and players half expected. During a 1982 start for the Astros, the umpire Don Denkinger warned Sutton that a mysteriously scuffed ball had come into the game. He asked Sutton not to throw it if he found another one like it. Sutton replied that he agreed completely, because those marked balls balls were so hard to throw straight. He was openly joking about the very thing he was accused of doing right to the umpire's face. The hysteria reached the very top of baseball. The Yankees owner George Steinbrenner was watching a game from his home in Tampa, far from the field. He got so angry at the way Sutton handled the ball that he picked up the phone and called his manager Lou Piniella in the dugout during the game. He demanded that Piniella have Sutton searched and punished on the spot. He went on a wild rant about wanting Sutton frisked, arrested, and dealt with right then and there. That is how worked up Sutton could make a grown man, a team owner, sitting hundreds of miles away. Even rival pitchers played along with the legend. The Yankees pitcher named George Frazier joked that he did not use any foreign substances because everything he used was made in the United States. It was a wink straight at Sutton's old Vaseline line. The whole league was in on the bit, and Sutton himself leaned into the circus harder than anyone. After being searched so many times, he joked that he ought to get a Black & Decker commercial out of it, since Black & Decker makes sanders and tools. And here's the punchline. He actually landed a commercial deal later. He turned the accusation that he cheated into a paycheck. It was all very funny. It was colorful. It made great stories. But step back and the negative truth is clear. The jokes did real work. They took something serious. The idea that a Hall of Fame career might have been built partly on cheating and turned it into harmless comedy. Laughter became a shield. The more people laughed, the less they pushed for answers. The clean version of Sutton survived because the dirty version was so entertaining. Now we reach a different kind of debate. Not about cheating, but about greatness itself. For years, baseball writers argued over one question. Was Don Sutton truly dominant, or was he just a compiler? That word matters. So let me keep it simple. The compiler is a player who builds giant career numbers, mostly by lasting a very long time. He is not always the best in any single season. He just never stops. He never gets hurt for long. He never has a bad year that knocks him out. He shows up for so many years that the totals pile up into something huge. The numbers look like the numbers of a god, but they were built one steady season at a time, not in a few blazing peaks. And many people put Sutton squarely in that group. The critics had real points. The Sutton won 20 games in a season only one time, back in 1976. Most all-time greats did that several times. He never won a Cy Young Award, the top honor for a pitcher. Not once in 23 seasons. He made only 4 All-Star teams in all those years. He was often standing in the shadow of bigger Dodgers legends like Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale, men who burned brighter, even if they burned shorter. And when fans named the truly dominant arms of his era, they reached for names like Nolan Ryan and Tom Seaver, not Sutton. He was rarely the most feared man on the mound. So the negative read is fair. Sutton's totals were enormous, but his peak rarely felt like the peak of an all-time great. He did not light up the sky in any single summer. He just kept burning steadily, quietly for far longer than anyone else around him. And yet the totals cannot be ignored because they are staggering. He won 324 games, which ranks 14th in all of baseball history. He struck out 3,574 batters, 7th most ever. He started 756 games, 3rd most ever. He pitched 5,282 and 1/3 innings, 7th most ever. He won 10 or more games in 21 different seasons. He reached 200 innings in 20 of his first 21 seasons, year after year of heavy work. In 1980, he even led the whole National League in earned run average at 2.21, the best mark in the league that year. He sits in a tiny club. He is one of only 10 pitchers in all of history, with more than 3,000 strikeouts, more than 300 wins, and a career earned run average under 350. Those are not the numbers of a fraud. They are the numbers of a master craftsman. He did not beat hitters with raw speed. He beat them with control and brains, and a deep bag of pitches. He ranked among the league's top 10 in strikeout to walk ratio 16 separate times. He led the league in base runners allowed per inning 4 times. That is not luck. That is precision, repeated over and over for more than 2 decades. There is even one strange little number that captures how focused he was. Across his whole career, Sutton came to bat 1,559 times without ever hitting a single home run. That is the most homerless plate appearances of any player since the game was integrated. He simply did not care about hitting. He treated the bat as someone else's job. Every ounce of his attention went into pitching, into surviving, into lasting. That single odd record tells you everything about how narrowly and how stubbornly he focused on staying useful. But here's where the negative angle holds. Because his career was so long and so steady, the harder truths got buried under the totals. The fights, the accusations, the legal escapes, the self-protection, all of it faded behind that giant wall of numbers. The clean version simply pointed at the totals and said, look how great he was. Skip the cost. It skipped the controversy. The numbers became a way to end the conversation, not a way to tell the full story. The bigger the totals grew, the easier it was to forget how he sometimes got there. There was one more knock on Sutton that deserves a closer look, because this one was not entirely fair. People said he could not win the big one. They said he failed in October, when the games matter most, and the pressure is highest. That label followed him early in his career and stuck to him for a long time. But the research tells a different story, and it is worth setting the record straight. In the National League Championship Series, the round just before the World Series, Sutton was excellent. He went 4 wins and 1 loss with a 2.02 earned run average across 7 of those high-pressure games. And in the 1974 postseason, he was almost untouchable. He went 3-0 with a 1.50 earned run average and 25 strikeouts in just 4 games. Those are the numbers of a man who rose to the moment, not one who shrank from it. So that particular criticism does not hold up well. Notice the bigger pattern here, because it is the real point. Even his strengths were fought over. People argued about his cheating. People argued about whether he was truly dominant or just a compiler. People even argued about his record in October, when the facts say he was good. Almost nothing about Don Sutton was ever allowed to be simple. His whole legacy was a battlefield picked over from every side. Praise and suspicion always traveled together. After his playing days ended in 1988, Sutton found a second life and a softer image. He moved into the broadcast booth in 1989. He joined the Atlanta Braves broadcast team on the TBS Superstation. He sat beside legendary voices like Skip Carey, Pete Van Wieren, and Ernie Johnson Sr. These were beloved men, the kind of broadcasters who feel like family to the fans at home, and Sutton fit right in beside them, and his timing was perfect. Sutton's voice became part of one of the great runs in all of baseball history. He called the famous worst-to-first 1991 Braves season, when a team that had finished dead last suddenly rose all the way to the top. He called their amazing streak of 14 straight division titles, a run no team had ever managed before. He called their 1995 World Series championship the crown on all those years of winning. For a whole generation of Braves fans, Sutton was simply part of the sound of summer. His voice meant baseball was on and life was good. In the booth, he built a warm and funny persona. He came across as folksy and easygoing. He played up being old-fashioned and a little afraid of new technology. In a 2012 broadcast, he joked that he believed everything he read on Wikipedia, as if it were all certain fact. He even had to ask his broadcast partner whether the word for using Twitter was really tweet. Fans loved it. It was charming. It was gentle. It made him feel like a kind old uncle telling stories in the booth, harmless and sweet. But think back to everything we just covered. This was the same man who once threw a baseball past an umpire on purpose. The same man who threatened to sue the entire National League to dodge a suspension. The same man accused of phoning the police on a struggling teammate who had already buried a child. The folksy voice was real, but it was also a soft cover over a very sharp mind. The man who charmed millions in the booth had spent decades battling teammates, umpires, front offices, and the league itself. The booth gave the public a kinder, simpler version of Don Sutton, and the public happily took it because the kinder version was so much easier to love. His final years were hard, and he faced them the way he faced everything, quietly and without quitting. Cancer kept coming back to him. He lost his left kidney to it in 2002. He had part of a lung removed in 2003. Most men would have stepped away from work after that. Sutton did not. He kept going. He stayed in the broadcast booth all the way until 2019, and he kept much of his health battle private the same way he had kept so much of himself private. The man's durability was never just about pitching. It was woven into who he was, right to the end. Then, before the 2019 season, he fractured his left femur, the large bone in the upper leg. The injury led to serious complications that he could not shake. He never fully recovered. He was never able to return to the Braves booth. The voice that had called all those great seasons, all those titles, and that championship went silent. He died peacefully at home on January 19, 2021, after his long and private battle with cancer. He was just 75 years old, and his death landed during a brutal stretch for the whole baseball world. The year 2020 had already taken 7 Hall of Famers, including Lou Brock, Tom Seaver, Bob Gibson, Phil Niekro, Whitey Ford, Al Killeen, and Joe Morgan. The game was burying its legends one after another. Then, just days before Sutton passed, his old manager Tommy Lasorda died on January 7, 2021. The same Lasorda who had built that Dodger family image all those years ago. The two men, so different in how they saw the game, left within weeks of each other. So what is the truth about Don Sutton? It is not the clean hero the tributes described, the gentle craftsman with the friendly voice. But it is not a simple villain either. The truth, like the man, lives in the messy middle. He was a hard, smart, stubborn survivor. He saw through the fake family image, and he said so out loud when most men would have stayed quiet. He fought a teammate in a cramped clubhouse and walked out bruised but unbroken. He made a phone call that may have saved his own job at another man's painful expense. He used legal threats to beat a suspension that should have stuck to him. He bent the edge of the rules for years and laughed his way out of every single search. He put his career and his family first, again and again, even when it cost him friends and made him enemies. Through all of it, he never stopped. He pitched longer than almost anyone in the history of the game. He turned skill, nerve control, and pure self-preservation into one of the most durable records baseball has ever seen. He was not heroic in the clean, simple way the public was told. He was something more human and more complicated than that. He was a realist in a sport that loves its myths. A man who refused to pretend even when pretending would have been easier and safer. The lie was never some secret conspiracy. There was no cover-up, no hidden crime. The lie was the smoothing over. It was the way baseball took a sharp, calculating, rule-bending competitor and quietly sold him as a gentle, classy hero. The real Don Sutton was tougher than that. He was harder than that. He fought for every inch of his career, and he did not always fight clean. And here's the strange thing. That real version, the one with the bruises and the lawsuits and the cold phone call, is far more interesting than the polished one ever was. The myth makes a nice statue. The truth makes a real man. He earned his place in the Hall of Fame. He earned the respect that came pouring in at the end. Nobody can take those 324 wins away from him, but he earned all of it as a fighter, not a saint. He earned it the hard way, through stubbornness and survival and a will that never broke. And that, the part the tributes always left out, is the truest thing anyone can say about Don Sutton.
About Japan, you talk about Dominican, you talk about Puerto Rico, you can talk about any country. You have to pay a posting fee to even entertain talking to their players. When Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier, where was the posting fee? So now there's no more Negro League. So now let's start going back to like, man, that's making me think. Was that done on purpose? See, now what we have to go back to.
Because after a while, you kind of just, you forget about how many teams you've been on.
Do you feel, you're not an old guy, but you've been around the block. Do you feel like an older player?
Yeah, I start to feel it now. I look at, Cano, our second baseman, and he's coming in, he's 22 years old, and I tell myself, what was I doing at 22 years old? And that was when I was in Milwaukee. It was a long time ago. I was the youngest on the team, and I can relate to it.
The sad truth about Gary Sheffield is not what most people expect. You clicked this video thinking you already know the story. The controversial quotes, the Balco cloud, the Cooperstown door that keeps slamming shut. But the real story is bigger than any one moment. It is the story of a man with one of the most dangerous bats in baseball history, who spent his entire career fighting a war he could never fully win. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icon. Sheffield was genuinely great. Not good, not solid. Great. 509 home runs. If you are enjoying this story, go ahead and use the hype feature right now and give this video some hype. It only takes a second, and it helps this channel grow more than you know. 2,689 hits, a National League batting title in 1992. He was the kind of hitter pitchers lost sleep over, but greatness alone was never enough for Gary Sheffield. And the reason why is the thing most will never stop long enough to understand. If you want to understand how a player this talented ended up this far outside the building, you have to start at the end, because the end tells you everything. December 7, 2025. Orlando, Florida. Contemporary Baseball Era Committee sat down to vote on 8 players who had not made it through the regular Hall of Fame ballot. The room included Hall of Famers like Robin Yount, Alan Trammell, and Ozzie Smith. 16 voters total. To get in, a player needed 12 votes, 75%. The ballot included Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, and Gary Sheffield. Jeff Kent was also on it. Jeff Kent, who spent most of his career being one of the better second basemen in the game without being a household name, walked out of that room as a Hall of Famer. He got 14 votes. Carlos Delgado got 9. Don Mattingly and Dale Murphy each got 6. Barry Bonds got 5. Roger Clemens got 5. And Gary Sheffield got fewer than 5. Sheffield could not even reach 5 votes out of 16. The committee would not be looking at him again until at least the 2028 cycle. And just like that, one of the most productive offensive players of the last 30 years was sent home again. That moment deserves to sit with you for a second. 509 home runs, career batting average of 292, more walks than strikeouts by 304, numbers that in almost any other era would have made the Hall of Fame fame a formality. But Gary Sheffield did not live in any other era. He lived in his era on his terms, and it cost him everything after the game. And to understand how he got to that room in Orlando with fewer than 5 votes, you have to go back to where the pattern started. And it started early, long before the big contracts, long before the Balco mess, long before Joe Torre and Derek Jeter and the GQ interview that set the internet on fire. It started in Milwaukee. The Milwaukee Brewers drafted Sheffield 6th overall in 1986. He was a Tampa kid, born and raised in a neighborhood where baseball was serious business. His uncle was Dwight Gooden. Yes, that Dwight Gooden, one of the most electric pitchers of his generation. Sheffield grew up around elite talent, and he knew from a young age that he had it too. His first professional assignment was with the Helena Brewers in Pioneer League. He hit 365 with 71 runs, batted in across just 57 games. Those are not minor league numbers. Those are numbers that make scouts stop what they are doing and pay attention. Problem was on the other side of the ball. His defense at shortstop was a mess. Wild throws, errors that made coaches wince, but the bat was undeniable. By 1987, putting up numbers that fight his age. 17 home runs, 103 runs batted in, 25 stolen bases, 81 walks against just 48 strikeouts. That walk-to-strikeout ratio is remarkable. It shows a hitter with discipline, with patience, deep understanding the strike zone. But even as those numbers were stacking up, something else was building underneath. Sheffield was clashing with his Class A manager, clashing with teammates, and scouting reports were starting to phrase that follow him for years, intentional errors. The allegation was that Sheffield, when he felt disrespected or slighted, would deliberately boot a ball or make a bad throw, on purpose, as a form of protest. The Brewers' front office was fully aware of behavior by the time they promoted him to Major League roster late 1988. They brought him up anyway. The bat was that, but they were never going to forget what they had read. The situation hit its lowest point in 1989. Sheffield was struggling both at the plate and in the field. Then he hurt his foot. Brewers told the public foot merely sore. They demoted him to AAA Denver and publicly stated the reason was in fielding, not the injury. Fielding. Sheffield made the trip to Denver, and it was only after he arrived that doctors officially diagnosed him with a broken foot. Broken, not a sore, not a foot that needed some rest, a broken bone. The organization had sent him down, called his effort into question in front of everyone, and the whole time he had been playing on a fracture. That moment crystallized something in Sheffield that never went away. He stopped trusting the people above him, not just the Brewers, baseball management in general. He decided they would put their interests ahead of his body, his health, and his reputation every single time. And he was going to fight back. When he returned from the injury, the Brewers moved him shortstop, third base. His replacement at short was Bill Spears. Sheffield did not see this as a football adjustment. In his 2007 memoir, Inside Power, he wrote about how white players received preferential treatment and how that reality made him angry. He connected the position switch to race. He believed the organization was making decisions about his body's role based on something other than baseball merit. That belief was not born in a vacuum. The Brewers had also started giving him drug tests that were described as not so random. The connection to Dwight Gooden, who had gone through rehabilitation for cocaine abuse, made Sheffield a target in the eyes of the organization. He felt watched, followed, singled out. Combined with the foot injury cover-up, position switch, he was done with Milwaukee before Milwaukee was done with him. He started demanding a trade from owner Bud Selig. Not once, not occasionally, daily, every single day. He wanted out. Think about what that period looked like from Sheffield's perspective. He had come into this organization as the 6th pick in the entire draft. He had put up numbers in minors that few teenagers in the history of the game could match. He had proven at every level that the bat was real. And what did he get in return? Broken foot called a sore foot. A position switch he believed was handed to a white player who had not earned it. Drug tests that seemed to appear whenever he was around a certain person. The relationship between Sheffield and the Brewers was not just broken by 1992. It had been poisoned so thoroughly that what started a talented young player finding his footing had turned an open war. And Sheffield was not the type to fight quietly, be loud about it. He was going to make sure everyone knew exactly how he felt and exactly who he believed was responsible. That instinct, the one that said speak up, push back, make noise, never go away, it just found bigger and bigger stages. The Brewers finally moved in 1992. The return was Ricky Bones, Jose Valentin, and Matt Miesge. For a player of Sheffield's ability, that is a weak package. Told you everything about how damaged the relationship had. They wanted him gone badly enough to take whatever was offered. And that is really full picture of Milwaukee. A franchise that drafted a generational talent, mismanaged his body, questioned his character in public, objected him to drug tests tied to nothing he had actually done, moved him off his position, and then accepted a below-market return just to end the headache. Sheffield walked away carrying a reputation as a saboteur. The Brewers walked away with 3 players who combined for a fraction of what Sheffield would go on to produce. Both sides left that relationship worse than they entered. And both sides, in their own way, helped create the version of Gary Sheffield that the rest of baseball would have to deal with for the next 15 years. Before he left Milwaukee, one thing happened that would define how the public saw him for the rest of his career. In a 1992 interview with a reporter from the Los Angeles Times, Sheffield said something extraordinary. He described a moment where, after being charged with an error he disagreed with, he responded by intentionally throwing the next ball into the stand, on purpose. as payback. Quote, hit like a bomb. It confirmed every scouting report, it confirmed every whisper. It gave the narrative a face and a voice. Sheffield later recanted the statement. He said it came from a place of raw frustration and was not literally true. And when analysts went back and play-by-play data from his multi-error games in Milwaukee, they found that the reality was far less dramatic, would suggest. In games on April 23, 1989, June 20, 1989, May 15, 1990, and April 8, 1991, when Sheffield made multiple errors, the batters only reached first base. No balls sailed into the stands. No fans scrambled for souvenirs off a spike throw. Physical evidence did not match the story. Sheffield himself later said the only time he may have actually done something like that was in the minor leagues, not the majors. But it did not matter. Quote was out there. The image locked. From that point forward, whenever anyone talked about Gary Sheffield's defense or his effort, relation franchise, that quote was right there waiting. He had handed his critics a weapon, and they never put it down. San Diego felt like a fresh start. For a moment, it looked like one. Sheffield arrived in 1992 and put together one of the best offensive seasons of his career. 33 home runs, 100 runs batted in, 330 batting average, won a National League batting title. He was magnificent, but even at his best, the friction never fully stopped. He found ways to alienate teammates. He made comments about who was getting paid more than him, who was getting more attention than him. Competitiveness that fueled his performance also made him difficult to be around. This is the part of the Sheffield story that deserves more attention than it gets. The friction was not always about money or race or managed decisions. Sometimes it was simpler than that. Sheffield had a way of making people around him feel like they were being measured, found wanting, like he was keeping a mental ledger of every perceived slight, every unfair distribution credit, every dollar that went to someone he believed was less deserving him. Players who play like that can be brilliant teammates when things are going well. But when the environment shifts, or when the organization starts making decisions they disagree with, that scorekeeping mentality turns outward fast. And in San Diego, it turned outward almost immediately. His salary climbed through arbitration, jumping from $750,000 over $3,100,000. Then the Padres ownership changed. Tom Werner came in and immediately started cutting payroll. Sheffield was expensive and combustible, and fit was over before it really began. In the summer of 1993, he was traded to the expansion Florida Marlins. The deal sent Trevor Hoffman to San Diego. Yes, that Trevor Hoffman, the Hall of Fame closer. Sheffield for Hoffman. Padres came out ahead on that one in the long run. Marlins saw Sheffield as the foundation of a new franchise. They gave him a 4-year contract worth $22,450,000 to right field. Sheffield worked at it. He adapted, put in the time learning the outfield. But even in Miami, something was off. His charitable work was not something did because it moved. According to what was written into his Marlins contract, community service was a negotiated obligation, part of the deal, required, written in like a performance clause. Critics noticed it painted his public goodwill gestures as transactions rather than genuine acts of generosity. That perception stuck too. His performance remained elite, and the Marlins rewarded him with a 6-year extension worth $61 million. At the time, that made him the highest paid player in baseball. But injuries intervened almost immediately. Hamstring problem, a surgically repaired thumb, played in only 135 games during the Marlins' 1997 World Championship season. The team won it all, and Sheffield was part of it, but he was not fully himself. The body that had carried him this far was starting to show cracks. There is a layer of irony in that 1997 championship that often gets skipped over. Sheffield had fought so hard for that $6 extension. He had leveraged and negotiated and pushed until he got the number he believed he deserved. And then the injuries came, and he could not even give the Marlins full season in the year they won it all. He present, tributed, but the version of Sheffield that signed that contract, version played that season, were not the same player. And right after the ring was handed out, the Marlins tore the whole thing down anyway. Championship roster was sold off piece by piece. Sheffield had bet on himself, gotten paid, won a title, and still ended up no longer wanted to be what it had been. Then the Marlins did what expansion franchises sometimes do. They blew it up. The championship roster was dismantled. Sheffield was going to be... The team had worked out a deal centered around sending him to Los Angeles Dodgers as part of a blockbuster trade built around catcher Mike Piazza. But Sheffield had a partial no-trade clause in his contract. He refused to approve the deal until the Dodgers agreed to terms that went far beyond what they had originally offered. What he eventually extracted was extraordinary. An additional $6 million in salary, a $3 million home in Los Angeles, and $1 million specifically to offset California's high state taxes. That is not a player accepting a trade. That is a player running a negotiation position of strength, leveraging the system to its absolute limit. He got every dollar, and he arrived in Los Angeles having already made clear what kind of relationship this was going to be. For a while, the Dodgers and Sheffield coexisted. Money was right. Production continued. By 2001, the relationship had collapsed completely. Sheffield wanted a lifetime contract extension from Dodgers chairman Bob Daly. Daly said no. Sheffield went to the Los Angeles Times and called the organization liars. He said with total certainty that they had not seen how tough he could get. He demanded a trade and gave the team a short list of acceptable destinations. The Yankees, the Mets, or the Braves. When he finally showed up to spring training, he was late. Reception clubhouse was cold. Of all his teammates, only Devin White made him feel welcome. Everyone else kept their distance. The Dodgers situation, one of the clearest examples of Sheffield's pattern playing out in real time. He had arrived as a high-maintenance acquisition, demanded extra money and a house and a tax offset to trade. Dodgers had agreed to all of it. They made every concession he asked for. So from their perspective, they had done everything right. They had met his terms. And still the relationship deteriorated. Still public attacks came. Still the demand for something more, something permanent, something bigger than what had been agreed upon, arrived right on schedule. The Dodgers front office had essentially gotten a preview of exactly how this was going to go. The moment Sheffield used his partial no-trade clause to squeeze them, they knew who they were dealing with. But they signed up anyway because the bat was worth, and then they paid for that decision for the next several years. Fallout from Sheffield's presence cost general manager Kevin Malone his job. Malone, already under pressure from the chaos surrounding the situation, got into a physical altercation with a fan who was heckling Sheffield game. The entire organization was being destabilized by one player's refusal to accept the terms he was being offered, and Sheffield had still not played a game for them that season. What happened next was one of the strangest and most consequential chapters of Sheffield's career. During the 2001 offseason, Barry Bonds invited him to train in Hillsborough, California. Sheffield was dealing with arthritic knees and wanted a program that would field. Bonds introduced him to his personal trainer, Greg Anderson. Sheffield resubs the Clear, which was a liquid form of designer steroid called THG. The cream, topical form of testosterone, and red beans, which were steroid pills imported from Mexico. Sheffield said he told the cream was an anti-inflammatory balm for his joints. He said the other substances were described to him as harmless nutritional supplements. When he asked questions, Bonds told him directly, "Do not ask questions. Just trust me. You are going to be okay." Sheffield testified about all of this before a federal grand jury on December 11, 2003. He described the training arrangement in detail and explained how the friendship bonds had broken down. The psychological game started early. Bonds would refuse to let Sheffield rent a car, leaving him stranded at the house before morning workouts, forcing him to take cabs. When Sheffield got his own rental car, Bonds locked him out of the house. Final break came when Bonds demanded Sheffield pay trainer Greg Anderson $10,000 for the substances he had been told were supplements, despite having previously promised to cover the costs. Sheffield paid the money, and then the friendship was over. He was named in the Mitchell report. His connection to Balco was documented and on the record. But Sheffield's public response was different from what happened to other players caught in the same net. In a 2007 appearance on HBO Real Sports, he dismissed the idea that he had knowingly used steroids. His argument was simple and pointed. He said steroids are something inject your body. He had not done that. He also raised the visual comparison between himself and Bonds, asking why he did not look like Bonds if he had taken the same substances. The argument was not scientifically airtight, but it worked in the court of public opinion because Sheffield's body had not transformed the way other players in the scandal had transformed. And because the story of Bonds manipulating him, stranding him, locking him out of a house, and then demanding payment for substances he had been promised were supplements, read like a genuine betrayal. The public mostly believed the manipulation narrative insulated him the kind of total reputation destruction that hit Mark McGwire or Rafael Palmeiro. Came out of the Balco chapter damaged but not destroyed. What the Balco story also revealed, and this is easy to overlook, is that even Sheffield's personal relation followed the same pattern of professionals. Friendship with Bonds had started from a place of genuine connection. Two elite players who had grown up in the same world, who understood the pressure being that good and that scrutinized. And it ended over rental car control, a locked door, and a $10,000 bill, not over something monumental, over petty financial manipulation and psychological games. Sheffield had spent years fighting institutes that he believed were trying to troll him. And then he found himself in a private house in Hillsborough being controlled by someone he trusted. The irony of that is hard to miss. The same instincts that told him to distrust baseball's management should hold him to ask harder questions in that training room. But the trust was there, and it was weaponized, and Sheffield ended up testifying before a federal grand jury because of it. His agent relationships followed a similar pattern of escalation and collapse. Over his 22-year career, Sheffield fired 3 agents. He eventually decided to represent himself entirely. The most dramatic falling out involved Scott Boras. After firing his previous representative Jim Nieder in the spring of 2001, Sheffield hired Boras. Boras was the most powerful agent in the game. He brokered Sheffield's trade for Dodgers to the Braves in January 2002 and negotiated the removal of an $11 million club option 2004 season. Elimination opened the door to free agency. Sheffield then fired Boras, represented himself, and signed a 3-year, $39 million deal with New York Yankees. Boras filed a grievance. He argued that his work in eliminating that club option was directly responsible for making the Yankees deal possible and that he deserved a percentage. In October 2008, arbitrator Joshua Javits ruled that Boras could not claim a cut of the entire Yankees contract, but he was entitled to a 5% fee on the eliminated $11 million option. That came out to $550,000. Sheffield was furious. He called Boras a bad person. He threatened to reveal ugly things about how sports agencies really operate. The anger was real. The money was paid. Pattern continued. Sheffield fighting the structures around him. Sheffield losing some battles even when he thought winning. What is striking about the Boras situation is that Sheffield had clearly won the larger negotiation. He fired Boras after Boras had done exactly what a great agent does, opened a door to a massive deal. Sheffield walked through that door, signed a $39 million contract, and then argued he should not have to pay for the key. The arbitrator disagreed, and Sheffield, who had built his entire career on the idea that institutions would always try to take from him what was rightfully his, found himself on the losing end of a financial dispute he had arguably brought on himself. Even his victories had a way of circling back, cost him something. His time with the Yankees brought him back to the highest stage in baseball. He performed, he hit, but the relationships inside the building were complicated from the start. In July 2007, shortly after being traded to Detroit Tigers, Sheffield sat down with reporter Andrea Creamer on HBO Real Sports and said what he had been thinking for years. He accused Yankees manager Joe Torre of maintaining a racial double standard. His argument was direct. Black players, Sheffield said, were criticized in front of the group. White players were called privately into Torre's office to discuss problems. He named Kenny Lofton and Tony Womack alongside himself as players who had experienced this treatment. He also said Torre had told him to his face that the Yankees should have gotten Vladimir Guerrero instead of Sheffield. What made those comments land so hard was the platform. This was not a frustrated player venting after a bad game. This was a deliberate, composed interview on a major national television program made after Sheffield had already left the organization. He had nothing left to protect inside that building. He was speaking because he wanted the record to reflect what he believed had happened, and whether people agreed with his interpretation or not, the specificity of the names and the situations gave the accusations a weight that a vague complaint never would have carried. The Yankees organization pushed back. A team official offered a different framing. It was not racism. It was a class system built around champions. Players who had won with Torre were treated one way. Players who were new were treated another. Sheffield, Lofton, and Womack had arrived without rings, and that was why the treatment felt different. Then came the Derek Jeter moment, when the interviewer pointed out that Derek Jeter, the Yankees captain, one of the most beloved players in baseball, was black. Sheffield responded with a comment that landed like a grenade. He said Jeter was black and white and that he was not all the way black. He argued that Jeter's mixed heritage and his status as an organizational favorite shielded him from the realities that other black players faced inside that clubhouse. Sheffield told Jeter directly, according to his own account, that the treatment Jeter received was specific to Jeter and did not reflect what others were going. Jeter said nothing publicly in response. His silence was loud. It underlined everything Sheffield had been saying about the gap in how the institution treated its stars and how it treated everyone else. The GQ interview from June 2007 added another layer to the conversation. In that piece, Sheffield spoke about the declining number of black American players in Major League Baseball. At that point, black American players made up only about 8% of the league. Sheffield argued this was not accidental. He believed MLB franchises were placing black American players with Latin American prospects, and his reasoning was blunt. He said the Latin players were easier for management control. He described it in terms of labor power and economic vulnerability. Players coming from other countries with fewer options and significant language barriers were less likely to challenge front office decisions, less likely to push back, less likely to demand the kind of autonomy that Sheffield had spent his career fighting for. He was not just making a racial argument. He was making an argument about labor control and national power. Critics called the comments inflammatory. They said the framing was unfair to Latin players who worked just as hard and deserved their spots. But Sheffield was not questioning the talent of Latin players. He was questioning the structural incentives that made teams prefer them over outspoken, labor-conscious American players like him. Personal danger he lived with off the field rarely got the attention it deserved. On October 30, 1995, Sheffield was sitting in his white Mercedes at a traffic light in East Tampa. His 7-year-old daughter was at cheerleading practice nearby, and he was killing time. A teenager approached the car and fired a single shot through the driver's side window. The bullet struck Sheffield in his left shoulder, leaving a flesh wound about the size of a dime. Sheffield feigned death to prevent the attacker from firing again. When the teenager left, Sheffield drove to a nearby barbershop and called for help. He was treated and released from St. Joseph's Hospital. He owned 3 handguns at the time, was not carrying one that night. He said afterward they felt blessed. The neighborhood where he had grown up, the neighborhood that had shaped him, nearly killed him. That moment never fully left. His personal life added more complications. His mother, Betty Jones, spoke publicly about her belief that many of his problems trace back to his choices in relationships. She described a pattern of women targeting his wealth. Sheffield fathered 3 children with 3 different women. The resulting legal battles, custody disputes, child support cases, and civil lawsuits from mothers whose claimed to fear him became a sustained source of negative headlines. His personal life was not a sideshow. It was a constant presence running alongside the baseball drama, giving his critics more material and making his path public redemption harder. All of it fed into what happened at Cooperstown. Sheffield spent an entire 10-year window on the Baseball Writers Association of America ballot, unable to reach 75%. He started at 11% in his early years on the ballot. He worked his way up slowly, painfully, year after year. In January 2024, his 10th and final year of eligibility with the writers, he peaked at 63.9%. Still short, still not enough. 63.9% is a majority. It is a strong majority, and it still was not enough to get him in. Think about what that climb represents. From 11% to 63.9 over 10 years. That is not a player being dismissed by voters who never considered him. That is a player who built a genuine case, who earned real support, brought a significant portion of the electorate to his side. The offensive argument is that strong. The problem is that even after all of that work, after all of those years on the ballot, after all of the analytical writing that made the case for his production, the final number was still short. And it was short in part because the voters who were holding back were not holding back over the stats. They had done the math. They knew what 509 home runs meant. What held them back was everything else. The stories, quotes, pattern, not unremember Gary Sheffield. And for a lot of the people who have voted on his candidacy, unremembering him was exactly what his induction required. The offensive case for Sheffield was substantial. The numbers were real. But his Hall of Fame candidacy had two major problems that the voters could not get past. The first was his defense. Historical defensive metrics are not kind to Gary Sheffield. They rate him as one of the worst defensive players in baseball history. He ranks second to Derek Jeter in career negative defensive runs saved. Critics argued that defensive struggles were not just a physical limitation. They pointed to the intentional error narrative, to the pattern of his defensive intensity declining when he was unhappy with franchise, and they connect everything they had seen throughout his career. Whether that was fair or not, the numbers existed, and they were bad. Modern analyticals like Jaws, which factor defense heavily into overall value, penalized him severely. The second problem was the era. Sheffield hit his 509 home runs during a period when offense was inflated by performance-enhancing drug use across the league. 500 home run club, once a near-automatic guarantee of Hall of Fame entry, lost some of its power as a benchmark. And Sheffield's own connection to Balco made traditionalist voters less willing to give him the benefit of doubt. When the writers' ballot window closed, his candidacy was referred to Contemporary Baseball Era Committee. That led to December 7th, 2025 in Orlando. 16 voters, 8 candidates. Jeff Kent walked out as a Hall of Famer. Sheffield walked out with fewer than 5 votes, unable to consider it again until at least on the same ballot, Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens also got 5 votes. Sheffield found himself grouped 2 most notorious names in the ED era, sharing the same outcome on a ballot he had been hoping would finally give him the recognition deserved. Now here's where this gets complicated, because Sheffield was right about some things. When he said the Brewers had mishandled his foot injury, the broken foot diagnosis put him right. When he said baseball management put institutional interests ahead of player health, history backed him up. When he raised questions about the racial dynamics inside MLB, he was speaking to real pattern the league itself has since acknowledged, given that Black American representation in the sport declined. His GQ argument about control and labor power, stripped of the inflammatory framing, touched on something real about how franchises have historically operated. Sheffield was not just a malcontent shouting into the void. He was an observer with real insight who often expressed that insight worst possible way at the worst possible moment. But insight does not cancel pattern, and the pattern was always the same. Sheffield would arrive somewhere with enormous talent. He would perform at an elite level, and then the friction would start. The demands, the public criticisms, the trade requests, the agent firings, the interviews that turned allies into enemies. He was not just difficult in isolated moments. He was consistently, deliberately difficult in ways that left institutional wreckage behind him wherever he went. Milwaukee, San Diego, Miami, Los Angeles, New York, Detroit. Every stop, the talent traveled with him. So did the conflict. And the conflict had a cost that the talent could not pay. The defiance that won him his biggest contracts, that got him the $6 million in extra salary from the Dodgers, that eliminated the club option Boras before firing him, that made him one of the highest paid players in the game. That same defiance burned bridges with almost every person it touched. Bat was real. Wins were real. Money was real. But the goodwill was gone. And when the voting booths opened, people in those rooms remembered how it felt to be on the receiving end of Gary Sheffield. They remembered the quotes, papers, the demands, the accusations, the chaos that seemed to follow him everywhere. And they voted accordingly. Baseball history is not going to erase what he did between the lines. 509 home runs do not. 2,689 hits do not disappear. A man who drew more walks than he struck out over a 22-year career does not get quietly forgotten. The numbers are permanent, they are in the books, and they are real. Sheffield could hit. He could always hit. The bat wag, violent, distinctive, and entirely his own, is part of baseball's visual memory, whether the assistant acknowledges it or not. But the lesson of his career is not about the numbers. It is about what happens when you spend 2 decades at war with every structure around you. He wanted autonomy. He got it. He wanted to be paid his worth. He wanted to speak the truth as he saw it. He did, loudly and repeatedly, without without apology. And the people who controlled the gates to the ultimate recognition remembered all of it. The time came to decide. Cooperstown door is not permanently closed. The 2028 cycle will come. The committee will meet again. His numbers will still be in the books. Whether the vote changes is a question nobody can fully answer right now. But what December 7, 2025 told us is that fewer than 5 of the 16 in that room were ready to separate the career from the man. And in the world of Hall of Fame voting, that is a problem that statistics alone cannot fix. There is something worth sitting with in all of this. Sheffield never pretended to be something he was not. He never put on a media-friendly face and played the game the way the institution wanted it. Played. He said what he believed, fought for what he thought was right, pushed back on things that genuinely deserved to be pushed back on, even when the timing was terrible and the delivery made people stop listening before the actual point landed. You can disagree with how he handled every situation and still recognize that the underlying grievances were often real. Broken foot was real. Drug test targeting was real. The racial dynamics inside baseball organizations have been well documented by people far fewer enemies than Sheffield. He was not making all of it up. He was a complicated person speaking complicated truths in ways that made it easy for one to dismiss him exactly that. But here's the thing about burning bridges. Once they are gone, they are gone. The people Sheffield burned were not just random bystanders. They were franchise executives, media members, Hall of Fame voters, people whose institutional memory is long and whose forgiveness, once exhausted, rarely comes back on its own. Every press conference where he called someone a liar, every interview where he went on the offensive, every contract demand that turned a potential ally into an adversary, those moments compounded. They formed a picture. And that picture, the time December 2025 arrived, was not a picture that 16 voters could look past in large enough numbers. Gary Sheffield gave baseball everything he had to white line. Nobody who watched play could argue otherwise. The swing was violent and gorgeous and terrifying. The production was consistent across 2 decades and half a dozen teams. He played hurt, played through surgeries. He adapted new positions in new cities more times players ever have. And then, after everything, the institution he spent his career fighting looked at all of it and said, not yet, maybe not ever. That is the sad truth, that the same fire that made him one of the most dangerous hitters of his generation also made him one of the most difficult people baseball has ever tried to honor. He burned too many of the right people. He said too many of the wrong things at the wrong times, fused winning arguing relationships. And the Hall of Fame is at its core a relationship vote. He could hit. That will never be taken away from. Baseball will remember the bat long after votes are forgotten. But talent alone does not protect. Have spent a career making enemies of the very people holding the ballots. That is the real Gary Sheffield story. If you learned something today or just enjoyed the deep dive, go ahead and like this video, subscribe to Baseball Icons so you never miss a story like this one, and drop your honest take on Gary Sheffield down in the comments below. If you think the Hall of Fame eventually lets him in? Let us know.